Sherlock Holmes at Hogwarts. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 176. People always believe what they want to believe. Sherlock, Hermione, and Ron followed Professor Lockhart toward the classroom. Professor Lockhart's extravagant turquoise robes were particularly striking in the interplay of light and shadow, making him resemble a proud peacock. He himself was affectionately embracing Harry, leaning slightly forward, constantly whispering something to him. To onlookers, his face was beaming, his eyes crinkled into crescent moons, and his meticulously styled hair shimmered golden in the sunlight, a truly handsome sight. Hermione walked beside Sherlock, her eyes fixed on Harry and Professor Lockhart ahead, her gaze full of curiosity. Finally, she couldn't resist gently tugging at Sherlock's sleeve. "Sherlock, can you deduce what Professor Lockhart is saying to Harry?" Before Sherlock could answer, Ron said impatiently, "Does it even need deduction? Harry'll tell us in a bit. It's definitely not discussing lessons." Professor Lockhart indeed wasn't discussing lessons with Harry. He was apologizing to Harry. "Harry, I'm sorry, I have to say, it's all my fault. Sometimes, I really want to kick myself." Harry stared in surprise at Professor Lockhart's gleaming white teeth in the sunlight, wondering what was going on. Why was Professor Lockhart apologizing to him? Could it be that the other person had already guessed his thoughts? Oh no, this Lockhart is unethical. He used legitimacy on him. Just as he was lost in thought, Lockhart continued, "Actually, I know why you did this." "Of course, it's obvious, huh?" Before Harry could react, Lockhart continued, "You and I were on the front page of the newspaper, so this time you thought of getting autographed photos. It's all my fault. I let you taste the sweetness of fame, and that's why you're addicted." Harry finally realized what was happening. He quickly shook his head and explained, "Oh, no, teacher, Harry. Oh Harry." However, Lockhart didn't give Harry a chance to explain. He reached out and grabbed Harry's shoulder, speaking to him in a fatherly tone, "I understand. For a young person like you, wanting more after trying something once is perfectly natural. It's not your fault, blame me. Even adults struggle to resist such temptations, let alone a little boy like you. So it's perfectly normal for you to be blinded by fame and fortune." Harry shook his head frantically. "But, I didn't, no need to explain. I understand." "Understand what? You understand nothing at all." Harry was frantic, but Professor Lockhart placed a hand on his shoulder and said earnestly, "But I have to say, it's unwise for you to be giving out autographed photos at this stage. Frankly, it will make you seem a bit arrogant, especially if someone is deliberately stirring things up. I just noticed that Mr. Malfoy from Slytherin was trying to stir things up and make others unhappy with you. He only left reluctantly after I showed up, abandoning his plan. But I can't always be there at the right time. So you need to calm down. There will be plenty of time when you're older." "No, I didn't." "It's a misunderstanding." Afraid that Lockhart would interrupt him again, Harry quickly explained what had just happened. "It was Colin Creevey. Colin Creevey insisted on taking my picture and asked for an autograph, but I didn't agree." "Is that so?" Lockhart tilted his head and then smiled. "No need to explain, Harry. Whether this was your intention or not is no longer important. In fact, I was even more ordinary than you are now when I was 12. I mean, some people already know you, don't they? Because of that person whose name can't even be mentioned, you've been a household name in the wizarding world since the day you were born." His gaze lingered for a moment on the lightning bolt-shaped scar on Harry's forehead. "Professor, I've already said I didn't mean it that way at all. Actually I know what you're trying to say. For you, while this isn't as glamorous as winning 5 Wizarding Weekly's Most Charming Smile awards, it's just the beginning. As I said before, I covered for you in front of Creevey this time. As long as he only filmed the two of us, your classmates won't think you're arrogant, and Malfoy won't cause you any more trouble." Harry, after being interrupted by Lockhart multiple times, Harry had given up trying to explain. No matter what he said, no one would listen. At this moment, he suddenly felt that Professor Lockhart was very similar to Dobby the Malfoy house elf. Both of them liked to talk to themselves, do their own thing, and explaining to them was futile. What infuriated him most was that they all thought they were doing it for his own good. At that moment, Sherlock's words echoed in his mind: to be kind to others unilaterally and presumptuously is a truly detestable act. So true. Sherlock wasn't lying. Professor Lockhart had already led Harry through a corridor filled with students and up the stairs. Seeing the two of them like this, all the nearby students stared at them in surprise. Under such scrutiny, Harry felt so embarrassed he wanted to dig a hole in the ground with his toes. However, Lockhart seemed to enjoy this feeling. Under everyone's gaze, he bent down in Harry's direction again, saying in an intimate gesture, "One day in the future, you'll be like me, needing to carry a stack of photos everywhere you go. But I don't think you're there yet, so for now, you have to listen to me." Modesty is the highest form of showing off. Finally reaching the classroom, with a soft chuckle from Professor Lockhart, he finally released Harry. Harry let out a long sigh of relief, quickly straightened his clothes, and ran to a seat in the last row as fast as he could, just to distance himself from Lockhart. When he noticed Lockhart's gaze occasionally drifting in his direction, he quickly piled the 7 books set in front of him. That way, he wouldn't see him. At this moment, the other students following Lockhart also entered the classroom one after another. In second year, the young wizard's seating arrangements were no longer fixed. Sherlock no longer needed to sit in the second to last row by the window. Seeing Harry in the last row, Sherlock, Hermione, and Ron naturally went over. As usual, Sherlock and Harry sat in the middle, with Hermione and Ron sitting on either side of them. "Hi man," Ron, seeing Harry's expression, couldn't help but elbow him. "Your face is redder than my hair right now." Greek letter Omega. Harry felt utterly ashamed. "You better pray that kid doesn't run into Ginny, or they'll probably start an HP fan club." Ron couldn't help but laugh as he said this. Hermione covered her mouth with her hand. Even Sherlock raised an eyebrow. "Ron, you definitely have a talent for making sarcastic remarks." Harry, on the other hand, panicked as soon as he heard this. Don't talk nonsense. If you say that again He stopped there. Because he didn't know what to threaten Ron with. Seeing his expression, Ron laughed even harder. "Although you don't like Professor Lockhart, what he said to you wasn't actually wrong, Sherlock." Harry looked at his best friend in surprise, seemingly not expecting him to say that. "Dear Harry, I think Professor Lockhart was just trying to warn you with his own experience that you shouldn't be doing something as ostentatious as giving out autographed photos." "Right, you were right again, but I didn't do anything," Harry said angrily. "I don't need his advice, obviously. He's projecting his own habits onto you." Looking at the annoyed Harry, Sherlock said calmly, "But objectively speaking, his appearance did save you from embarrassment. When word gets out, people will only think that Professor Lockhart forced you to take a photo, not that it was your own wish." "But I didn't do anything," Harry emphasized again. "Your opinion doesn't matter." Sherlock's gaze lingered on Lockhart's turquoise robes for 2 seconds before he continued. "People tend to believe what they want to believe, even when the facts are right in front of them. To others, the savior of the wizarding world handing out autographed photos sounds far more appealing than it's a misunderstanding. I wouldn't be surprised if one day news spread in the wizarding world that the savior wants to maintain his popularity, so he deliberately fabricated a lie that Voldemort has returned." Harry, after a moment of surprise, fell silent. Hermione, however, looked at Sherlock with delight. "So you also think Professor Lockhart is amazing, right, Sherlock?" Sure enough, Sherlock thought the same thing as me. Ron, on the other hand, looked bewildered. Had he really misunderstood Professor Lockhart? Was he actually another Professor Snape? What was that saying again? A wicked but kind good man. "So, should I thank him?" Harry, now regaining his composure, asked hesitantly. "No need for that," Sherlock chuckled. "As I just said, Professor Lockhart's actions only objectively helped you. Subjectively, he's still using your name to promote himself. My suggestion is, let's each get what we need. Let's each get what we need. Yes, to be precise, his existence is very useful to us." Useful. This time, Harry, Hermione, and Ron were all taken aback. Saying a professor is useful to them? What a strange way of describing it. Just then, all the students were seated, and Professor Gilderoy Lockhart cleared his throat loudly, quieting everyone down. The three of them could only suppress their questions and turn their attention to Professor Lockhart. "Thanks to Master and Disciple for the 100 Kidian coins reward to Lunar Lovagid. Your support is my motivation to update." Chapter 177 The Fallen Lion King and the Know-It-All. All the young wizards were filled with anticipation for the upcoming Defense Against the Dark Arts course. It must be said, in terms of appearance alone, Gilderoy Lockhart was impeccable. Although almost everyone knows that judging by appearance is wrong, in reality, they still unconsciously do so. Like now, for example. Even without doing anything, just standing there, Professor Lockhart already gave off a far superior feeling than Quirrell. There was no way around it, compared to Quirrell, who reeked of garlic, wore a strange scarf, had twitching eyes, and stuttered. The handsome Professor Lockhart was on a completely different level. To put it bluntly, even in the magical world, looks matter. The young witches looked at Lockhart with sparkling eyes, a few even having heart-shaped eyes. Sitting in the front row was the round-faced Neville Longbottom. Seeing that everyone's attention was focused on him, Professor Lockhart casually picked up Neville's Walking with Trolls from the table and held it up in his hand. The cover featured a photo of Lockhart winking, facing the young wizards as he slowly introduced himself. I am Gilderoy Lockhart, a third class of the Order of Merlin, an honorary member of the League Against the Dark Arts, and a 5-time winner of the Wizarding Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award. Of course, I won't wear that on my sleeve, because I don't use smiles to banish the Banshee of Bandon. Lockhart's admirers were mostly women, spanning a wide age range. There were young witches like Hermione, obsessed with legends, and middle-aged witches like Mrs. Weasley. Therefore, if the students in his Defense Against the Dark Arts class were all women, it would be a game-changer. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible. There were naturally no middle-aged witches in the class, so Professor Lockhart's self-introduction didn't have the effect he had envisioned. Mainly, the young girls were rather shy and couldn't give him the enthusiastic response he expected. You say you don't keep bringing it up, but you already said it at the opening ceremony. Ron's disgust seemed even greater than Harry's when facing Lockhart. He muttered, then just don't say it. Lockhart's gaze swept over the class again, and he continued, I see you all bought my complete works. That's great, as if we wanted to buy them. It's clearly a mandatory requirement on the book list. Ron muttered again. He was very resentful. Because Lockhart's books were really expensive. With Ginny starting school at Hogwarts this year, their family had to buy a full 5 sets of textbooks. What's worse, there weren't even any second-hand copies of his books. So before shopping, the family had to go to the Wheel-Eyes vault at Ringett's Wizarding Bank and take out all their savings. With the help of Bill and Charlie, who had already left school, they scraped together the money for a long time to get all 5 of their children this set of books. After a somewhat flamboyant self-introduction, Professor Lockhart continued, however, before today's formal lessons begin, I'd like to give you a little quiz. So much trouble, Ron exclaimed for the 3rd time. Ronald, Hermione was very unhappy with Ron's repeated complaints about Professor Lockhart, and even Lavender, Petty, and other girls nearby gave him dangerous looks. Ron immediately fell silent. Hearing Professor Lockhart's words, except for a few, the entire class instinctively tense up. In fact, most students had similar attitudes towards exams. This was true in both the Muggle and magical worlds. Professor Lockhart noticed everyone's gaze and gave a gentle smile. Don't be afraid, I just want to see how well you read and how much you've understood. Of course, even if you don't understand anything, I won't deduct any points. Hearing Lockhart say he wouldn't deduct points, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. In the blink of an eye, he waved his wand, and dozens of papers flew into everyone's hands. You have 30 minutes. Start the timer now. The young wizards all lowered their heads to look at the papers handed to them. Then, what is Gilderoy Lockhart's favorite color? Harry froze upon seeing the first question. What the heck was this? He composed himself and looked down, only to find the following questions. What is Gilderoy Lockhart's secret ambition? What do you think is Gilderoy Lockhart's greatest achievement to date? What is Gilderoy Lockhart's birthday? What is his ideal birthday present? These were all similar questions, filling 3 whole pages. Harry stared at Sherlock, his green eyes filled with confusion. Dude, is this the professor you think will be useful to us? By useful, you don't mean making the whole class mass-produce funny faces in front of the exam paper, do you? Sherlock naturally noticed his friend's gaze. He sighed and said to Harry, my dear friend, my suggestion for this exam is to answer from the back to the front. Harry was even more confused. Back in Muggle school, teachers had indeed taught us to tackle the last, most difficult questions first, then the earlier ones. But this exam, given by Professor Lockhart, was entirely short answer questions. What difference did it make whether we went from front to back, or back to front? Turning to the last page with a puzzled look, Harry froze again. Hermione and Ron, of course, had also heard Sherlock's words to Harry. Both of them curiously turned to the last page, and then, like Harry, they froze. The last question was indeed a short answer question, but its style was completely different from the previous ones. What are the weaknesses of vampires? The second to last question. Please describe in detail the specific process by which Gilderoy Lockhart dealt with a werewolf. Moving forward, after Gilderoy Lockhart broke with a banshee, the Banshee of Death, what methods did he use to exorcise it? If the conditions weren't right, what other methods could he have used to exorcise it? These kinds of questions were all excerpts from the adventure stories he had written in his books. Although there were only 7 questions like this on the entire exam paper, a paltry 1/8 of the 56 questions, it was still enough to surprise the 3 of them. Hermione clenched her fists in surprise. She hadn't misjudged him. Professor Lockhart was indeed capable. Harry and Ron exchanged a glance, their eyes filled with utter shock. Had they really been wrong? Beneath Lockhart's flamboyant exterior lay a pragmatic side. Although he seemed to be acting recklessly on the surface, he had actually planned everything meticulously. In any case, the exam paper Lockhart had given them had indeed changed their perception of this defense against the dark arts professor somewhat. The other young wizards, after discovering the last few questions, shared similar feelings with Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And their gazes towards Professor Lockhart changed considerably. However, the content of the exam paper was rather disjointed. To put it another way, the first half was more like Lockhart's research group's content. Only the latter part was related to the defense against the dark arts course. Half an hour passed quickly. When the time was up, Professor Lockhart collected the students' papers. Then, to the astonishment of the entire class, he began grading them on the spot, seemingly oblivious to everyone else. While grading, he commented, "Tisk tisk, almost no one remembers that my favorite color is lilac, something I mentioned in A Year with the Yeti. It seems a few students need to reread Wandering with the Werewolves, because in chapter 12 of that book, I clearly stated that my ideal birthday present is, for all people, whether they have magic or not, to live in harmony. Of course, I wouldn't refuse a large bottle of Ogden Old Fire whiskey, if it weren't for the unusual style of the last 7 questions on the exam. Most people wouldn't have listened to his awkward comments. Even so, some of the younger wizards, represented by Ron, still looked at him with distrust. Seamus Finnegan and his friend Dean Thomas, sitting in the front row, tried their best not to laugh out loud. Gilderoy Lockhart? He's just a novelist, what does he know about dark magic? Of course, some young wizards were also listening intently to his comments, such as Neville in the first row and Hermione in the last. Harry couldn't help but glance at Sherlock beside him. When he found that Sherlock was also looking at Lockhart with interest, he patiently listened as well. Just then, Professor Lockhart suddenly mentioned Hermione's name. Miss Hermione Granger, hearing her name, Hermione, who had been listening intently, was startled. She looked at Professor Lockhart in surprise. Not only does she know the answers to the above questions, but she also knows my secret ambition is to eliminate all evil in the world and to sell my own Ophiuchus Egg hair conditioner. Good girl, a very good girl. In fact, Professor Lockhart turned Hermione's paper over and said with a look of delight, 100 points. Who is Miss Hermione Granger? Hermione excitedly raised a trembling hand. Excellent. Professor Lockhart looked at Hermione and said with a smile, very good, very good. I will give Gryffindor an extra 20 points for this. The entire class stared at Hermione in astonishment. Hermione was a name all too clear to her fellow wizards. Despite her Muggle upbringing, she was an undisputed academic star. No professor had ever stumped her in class. Not only had she been the top scorer last season, but she had also unanimously secured first place in her grade at the end of last year's exams. With her abilities, answering the last few questions would be no problem at all. But the problem was, she even knew the answers to those trivial questions from before. That was absurd. Who would bother remembering an author's favorite color or their ideals? Miss Know-It-All, you've fallen. Just as the young wizards were hesitating, Professor Lockhart, who was grading papers, once again showed a look of surprise. Who is Mr. Sherlock Holmes? His paper is also perfect. Seeing Sherlock calmly raise his hand, the entire class of wizards was shocked, even more so than when they heard Hermione had gotten a perfect score. The Cubs attending classes with a Gryffindor were relatively better off. But the lion cubs were collectively in an uproar. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. How could Sherlock do this? Lion King, you've fallen. Thank you to Quing Shui Zhiz for the 500 Kidian coins reward. Your support is my motivation to update. By the way, it seems my luck is better than I expected. I thought it would be a big task, but I solved it easily. So, starting today, I'll resume normal updates, one chapter each at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. Oh. Chapter 178. Surely it doesn't have to come to the point of sacrificing me? Gilderoy Lockhart was unaware that the little lions in his class were in a state of shock. After finishing reading Sherlock's test paper, he excitedly announced to the class, "Mr. Holmes got every single answer correct. He knew vampires' weaknesses were garlic and silver, and that they couldn't enter a house without an invitation. He pointed out that I used the mirror reflection charm when driving away the banshee in Ireland, and that burning juniper and sprinkling salt could also subdue them. He described in detail how I defeated the vulgar werewolf using a series of methods, including observing the moon phases, using the earplugs charm, setting up the ironclad charm, spreading the devil's web seed, and finally using a series of spells." Lockhart looked at Sherlock, a hint of regret in his eyes. "Unfortunately, this student only answered the last few questions, so I can only add 5 points to Gryffinder's score. What a pity. Why didn't you do the earlier questions too? That way, you could have won another 20 points for Gryffindor, just like Miss Granger." Professor Lockhart shook his head regretfully, adding 5 points to Gryffindor's score. While he cried out in disappointment, the young wizards in the class breathed a long sigh of relief, especially the lion cubs. That's more like it. A lion king is a lion king, how could he possibly fall? Sherlock didn't answer Professor Lockhart's question. For him, this test perfectly illustrated his attitude towards knowledge: only learn what's useful, don't learn what's useless. Even after reading Gilderoy Lockhart's series and initially memorizing the content, he later deliberately forcibly forgot it. Just as he had said in his astronomy class last year, for knowledge he was certain wouldn't be used, even if he accidentally memorized it, he would find a way to forget it. However, Lockhart's explicit statement that his wish was for all people, whether magical or non-magical, to live in harmony was somewhat unexpected for Sherlock. After all, none of the wizards Sherlock knew had ever said anything like that. Not even the Wheeleyes, who were extremely friendly to muggles. This man was indeed quite interesting. Seeing that Sherlock didn't answer his question, Professor Lockhart didn't press further. After grading all the papers, he shook his head and said, "The other students are quite regrettable. If you could know all my secrets like Miss Granger and Mr. Holmes, especially like Miss Granger, you could become as excellent as them. Alright, let's get back to the point. I've already heard about what happened last semester from Headmaster Albus. As a course that demands a high degree of practical application, teaching defense against the dark arts simply by rote memorization isn't enough. And that's exactly what your professor did last semester. Although I don't like to speak ill of people behind their backs, I have to say, Professor Quirinus Quirrell wasn't a good defense against the dark arts professor. Of course, compared to me, there aren't many professors who can be considered excellent." Although he was both praising himself and putting down Quirrell, Professor Lockhart's statement this time didn't cause the same controversy as before. Because he was stating the facts. Professor Quirrell was essentially a ruthless repeater. Although the first-year curriculum was covered on schedule last semester, it was essentially just reading from the textbook. In short, it was all PPT presentations, no EGS files. Ironically, it was Severus Snape, the Slytherin headmaster and temporary substitute potions professor, who taught them some real skills. Harry's most proficient Expelliarmus weapon was learned during that time. Of course, at the end of the semester, everyone learned that Quirrell's motives were impure. His goal was the Philosopher's Stone. It was understandable that someone like that wouldn't teach properly. Seeing that the students agreed with his words, Professor Lockhart nodded in satisfaction. "Very good, time to show the real skills." He coughed lightly, drawing everyone's attention, then bent down and pulled a large, cloth-covered cage from behind the podium, placing it on the table. This action made Harry and Ron exchange another glance, both seeing the surprise in their best friend's eyes. "Lockhart, he actually prepared. Of course I won't be reading from the textbook like your last defense against the dark arts professor." Taking in the young wizard's gazes, Professor Lockhart smiled slightly. "As your first lesson of the school year, I intend to teach you how to defend against the most evil thing known in the wizarding world. And also, The most terrifying thing you'll face in this classroom. But that's alright, as long as I'm here, you won't be harmed. Now, I only ask that you remain calm. Having laid enough groundwork, Professor Lockhart's words naturally attracted the attention of the entire class. Harry couldn't resist peeking out from behind the pile of books, wanting a better look at the cage. When Professor Lockhart placed a hand on the cover, Dean and Seamus in the front row stopped laughing. Neville in the first row shrank back even further. "I must ask you not to scream," Professor Lockhart whispered, "because that will provoke them." As almost the entire class held their breath, Professor Lockhart abruptly rips open the cover, revealing the creature inside. "Perhaps some of you recognize them," Professor Lockhart said in a tone as if performing a magic trick. "These are the Cornish elves I just caught." The elves were a dark blue-green color, about 8 inches tall, with small, pointed faces. As soon as Professor Lockhart removed the cage, they began chattering and jumping around. Not only that, they shook the cage frantically, making all sorts of bizarre faces at those nearby. Judging from their voices, these little creatures had shrill, piercing voices, like a bunch of parrots arguing. "Bloody hell. I actually believe his nonsense." Ron was immediately deflated at the sight. The others in the class reacted similarly, with many young wizards even scoffing. Some of the young witches were kind enough not to laugh directly. However, judging from their forced smiles, it was clear this wasn't the screaming Lockhart wanted. Hell, Professor Lockhart took in the expressions of the young wizards and smiled at Seamus in the front row. "Mr. Seamus Finnegan, you think they're not scary, or rather, not very dangerous, right?" Seamus didn't answer, but judging from his almost breathless laughter, he clearly thought so. "Don't look down on them." Professor Lockhart shook his head at Seamus with a hint of helplessness. "You know, their magical creature classification at the British Ministry of Magic is XXX. They're mischievous by nature, a bunch of cunning little vandals, and also great practice subjects." Despite Professor Lockhart's words, few of the young wizards took them to heart. Only Neville, sitting in the front row, seemed frightened by his words and shrank back under the table. The main reason for the young wizard's reaction was that the magical creatures Professor Lockhart called Corndine pixies were not dark magic creatures. In fact, their real name was simply pixie. The reason they're called Cornian is because these creatures are primarily found in Cornwall, England. Of course, they are indeed very mischievous, and their level of mischief is certainly not a problem. But in the eyes of most wizards, they are almost harmless. Professor Lockhart's claims that they are the most evil things known in the wizarding world, the most terrifying things to encounter in this classroom, and that screaming will enrage them, are far too exaggerated. Alright, seeing that few people were listening to him, Professor Lockhart raised his voice. "Since you're so confident, let me see how you deal with them." Just then, Sherlock glanced at the tall stack of Lockhart books in front of Harry and patted him on the shoulder. "Dear Harry, if I were you, I would put them away right now." As he spoke, he put all his textbooks, ink, and quills from the table into his bag. Although Harry didn't understand what was going on, he always obeyed Sherlock, so without a word, he threw all 7 books that he had been using to block his view into his bag. Hermione and Ron followed suit immediately. Harry and Ron did it without knowing why. Hermione, however, understood the reason the moment Sherlock reminded her. The next moment, Professor Lockhart opened the cage door. Boom! The elves burst out of their cages with lightning speed, like a whirlwind. Once free, they rampaged and flew about wildly. Neville, in the first row, was already prepared, so the moment Professor Lockhart opened the cage door, he immediately ducked under the table. This action saved him from certain death. But this made Seamus, sitting in the front row and laughing the loudest, the first to be hit. Seamus was still smiling when 2 elves grabbed him by the ears and lifted him up. "Oh no, let me go. Let me go." "There, no," he struggled desperately, but being suspended in midair with no leverage, he was completely helpless. He could only let them do as they pleased. However, this was merely one scene in the chaos. Several of the elves, particularly eager for freedom, smashed through the windows as soon as they burst from their cages, their destination clear. They crashed through the glass. The cold wind rushed in, instantly making the classroom air feel fresher. The remaining elves, of course, weren't idle. They wreaked havoc in the classroom. Some grabbed ink bottles and splashed ink all over the class, some threw the young wizards' bags and textbooks out of the broken windows, some turned the trash cans upside down, and others tore the textbooks on the desks and the pictures on the walls to shreds. Only the 4 students in the last row, reminded by Sherlock, had packed their things early and escaped unscathed. Bloody hell. Damn it. Sherlock, thank goodness you reminded me, his books are ridiculously expensive, Ron exclaimed, thankfully trying to crawl under the desk. But as soon as he made that move, Sherlock grabbed him. Sherlock was strong, forcefully preventing Ron from crouching down. Hey, what are you doing? Ron looked at Sherlock with a puzzled expression. Seriously, what do you mean? I know our relationship isn't like Harry and Hermione's, but that doesn't mean I have to be sacrificed, does it? Chapter 179. He is not fighting alone. They're mischievous by nature, a bunch of cunning little vandals, and also excellent practice subjects. Sherlock stopped Ron from crawling under the table, repeating Professor Lockhart's words from before opening the cage. Ron hesitated for a moment, but after looking at the sprites flying everywhere and then at the other young wizards already hiding under the table, he finally understood Sherlock's meaning. His gaze turned serious, he swallowed hard, and slowly drew his wand. Then, I'll try. He hesitated slightly, then became firm. I'll try. At the same time, Professor Lockhart in the lecture hall was shouting loudly, quick, quick, get them together. No one paid him any attention. Seamus, who had just been laughing the loudest, was now swaying in the chandelier above the classroom. It had been lifted up and hung there by 2 sprites. As for the other students, half hid under the table, while the other half frantically tried to protect their stationery, clothes, and themselves. Noticing the Lockhart series books the young wizard had placed on the table had been torn to shreds by the elves, Professor Lockhart's lips curled into a barely perceptible smile. However, he quickly suppressed his smile, shouting in anguish, "They're just a bunch of elves. Weren't you laughing so happily just now? Catch them back in their cages." In the chaos, a student in the front row yelled, "If you're so capable, you do it." Professor Lockhart's face darkened at this. He immediately rolled up his sleeves, brandished his wand, and shouted, "Peshipsy, pestronomy," but it was to no avail. The elves continued their rampage. Just then, the chandelier hanging from Seamus finally gave way and crashed down. At the same time, an elf shrieked and charged towards Lockhart, its target the wand in his hand. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of hesitation crossed Professor Lockhart's face. But this expression only lasted a split second. He focused slightly, his face hardening as if covered in frost. As Professor Lockhart dodged Seamus's attack, he waved his wand again and chanted a second spell. This time, the spell was much simpler, freezing ground. This time, his spell worked. The sprite flying towards Lockhart seemed to freeze in time, plummeting straight down from the sky. Professor Lockhart, energized by successfully stopping the sprite, unleashed a triple attack, freezing ground, freezing ground, freezing ground. Several sprites within his attack range fell from the sky. Professor Lockhart's actions also alerted the other young wizards, who began casting spells to deal with the sprites. Next, the young wizards in the classroom, each choosing their own path, began to unleash their magic, finally starting to fight back. Undoubtedly, the last row was the most efficient in terms of spell casting. Sherlock was about to intervene as well, but just as he raised his wand, Hermione grabbed his hand and pressed it down. "Sherlock, you can't keep spoiling them like this." Hermione stared into Sherlock's gray eyes and said seriously, "Leave it to us this time." Since Hermione volunteered, Sherlock naturally wouldn't refuse. If they were going to seek excitement, they might as well go all the way. Harry initially used the same freezing charm as Professor Lockhart. Although it hadn't been taught in charms class, he had seen it in the textbook. Seeing that Professor Lockhart used it effectively, he tried it out. Unfortunately, he wasn't Sherlock or Hermione. Due to insufficient familiarity, the effect was less than ideal. So he decisively switched to the more proficient full-body binding charm. With a few petrify spells, the elves' wings and legs immediately pressed tightly together, their bodies arching backward as they plummeted from the sky. His success rate and accuracy were good. He quickly eliminated several of the last row of unruly elves. Hermione didn't have this problem. A few freezing ground spells, and the elves fell from the sky one after another. Ron started using spells, but his accuracy was clearly inferior to Harry and Hermione's. He missed several spells in a row and almost had his wand stolen by a cunning house elf. Damn it! My wand! Ron treasured the Christmas gift Sherlock had given him. Now, seeing his beloved weapon about to be taken away, he was filled with rage. Explosive charm. Without hesitation, He threw an explosive charm into the air. While casting the spell, he even gave himself a mental suggestion: I am Seamus, I am Seamus, I am Seamus. Whether it was the suggestion that worked, or the explosive charm's effectiveness in this environment, the ricochet effect caused 2 or 3 house elves to fall from the sky, a more effective result than Harry and Hermione's. Ron's spirit soared at the sight. However, the next moment, someone shouted urgently, "Weasley, it's friendly fire." Stop! Several Hufflepuff students in the second to last row, who were very close to Ron, turned pale. They had been caught in Ron's crossfire. Ron, who had just been in high spirits, was immediately dejected. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." Before he could finish speaking, the Hufflepuff screamed again, "No, let go of my book, my money, Weasley, give them another shot." Encouraged by his classmates, Ron's spirits lifted again. "All right." Explosive charm. With a series of loud explosions, Ron deliberately threw explosive charms at the densest areas of the Hufflepuffs. One after another, the house elves were hit by this area of effect magic, screaming as they fell from the sky. This instantly put him ahead of Harry and Hermione in terms of kill count. Ron had done it. He hadn't given the Cornish house elves any chance. As a member of the 28 holy pureblood families, Ron inherited the glorious traditions of the Weasley family, with Bill, Charlie, and Percy's spirits possessing him at this moment. He wasn't fighting alone. With someone leading the way, the rest was much easier. The young wizards helped each other, working together with great effort, and finally managed to put all the elves back into their cages. Of course, there was nothing they could do about the elves that had already flown out of the classroom. "Very good, you did a great job." Looking at the panting young wizards, Professor Lockhart once again flashed his signature smile. This time, however, no one laughed at him. Especially the little witches standing behind him. Because after Professor Lockhart successfully dealt with several elves using the freezing charm, the few little witches closest to him immediately ran to his side, hoping to try their luck. Professor Lockhart didn't disappoint them. He firmly guarded the area within a few feet around him, preventing the elves from intruding. Seeing that Professor Lockhart was truly effective, even some boys ran over and were also saved by him. So now, the little witches looked at Professor Lockhart with starry eyes, some even with hearts in their eyes. Professor Lockhart regained the elegance he had at the beginning of the class. His gaze swept over everyone in the classroom as he slowly said, "I already said they are excellent practice subjects. Unfortunately, some students don't seem to agree." Seamus blushed upon hearing this. He was one of those who disagreed with Professor Lockhart. To make matters worse, he had landed near Professor Lockhart when he fell from the chandelier. It was only because of Professor Lockhart's protection that he hadn't been picked up and thrown out by the elves a second time. "Fortunately, you didn't disappoint me in the end and successfully completed the task, but," looking at the mess in the classroom, Lockhart sighed deeply, as if he were disappointed in you all. "Look at what you've done. Letting these little devils run rampant, some of you even hiding under the desks. I know you didn't learn anything real last semester, but I never expected you to stoop to this level. Of course, it's not entirely your fault. How can you teach well with a defense against the dark arts professor like this? If this continues, Hogwarts will become a laughingstock in the wizarding world." The young wizards fell silent. Their performance was indeed terrible. What they found most unacceptable was that it was the elves they looked down upon who had caused this mess. However, Professor Lockhart's tone suddenly changed. "I am still very pleased that several students performed exceptionally well." He then looked towards the last row. Mr. Harry Potter, Miss Hermione Granger, and this redhead, Ron Weasley. Despite still disliking Professor Lockhart, Ron realized what was about to happen and quickly called out his name. "Very good, these 3 students performed the best. They not only protected their belongings but also subdued the largest number of house elves. Each of you has earned Gryffindor 15 points. Thunderous applause erupted in the classroom. Everyone was convinced by Lockhart's bonus. This was the first time they had encountered such a practical lesson in defense against the dark arts. Although the story of the Lion King, the Savior, and Miss Know-It-All stopping Professor Quirrell's adventure last year was widely known, no one had actually witnessed it. Until today, the young wizards were seeing the Savior and Miss Know-It-All's strength for the first time. And Ron of the Wheel Eyes was unexpectedly capable as well. As for the Lion King who didn't fight, well, he must have thought these house elves weren't worthy of his attention. As the bell rang, Professor Lockhart left the classroom, surrounded by a group of young witches. Ron was still basking in the joy of Gryffindor winning 15 points. He rarely had such opportunities to perform. For him, not losing points was already the best outcome. Finally snapping out of his reverie, Ron hurriedly asked, "Sherlock, do you think we can trust him?" "Lockhart, Professor Lockhart, he may not have been able to control the situation, but he doesn't seem like a complete idiot." "Ron, what nonsense are you talking about?" Hermione immediately retorted. "The professor just wanted to give us some practice opportunities. Unfortunately, none of us took advantage of them." Chapter 180 An Unexpected Turn of Events. Miss Granger is absolutely right, it was a truly impressive practical lesson. Seamus Finnegan, hearing Hermione's words, leaned closer and said with lingering fear, "I had no idea these guys were so strong." He rubbed his ears, hissing involuntarily. Just a short while ago, two house elves had grabbed him by the ears and lifted him into the air, leaving him hanging from a chandelier for quite some time. It must have hurt. His friend Dean Thomas couldn't help but say, "Hey, buddy, do you think it's because you mocked Lockhart earlier that he did this on purpose?" "Impossible. Absolutely impossible." Before Seamus could answer, Hermione interrupted, "Professor Lockhart isn't that kind of person." Before, everyone else would have scoffed at Hermione's statement. But after this first defense against the dark arts class, everyone felt they couldn't quite understand this professor. You might think this professor was capable, but his words were flamboyant, his manner arrogant, and yet he managed to put on such a laughable test in the first trial class. If it weren't for the last few questions that served as a cover, the defense against the dark arts course could simply be renamed Lockhart Studies. But you could say he wasn't capable. The little elves, initially looked down upon by the junior wizards, did indeed give them a rude awakening, just as he claimed. More importantly, although he seemed to have lost control at the beginning, he genuinely protected the students in the latter half. All the wizards who dared to approach him were unharmed. So, how to put it? It's just baffling. At this moment, everyone looked towards Sherlock. Although only a year had passed, for the Gryffindor Lion Cubs, this was already a tacit understanding. When faced with something requiring thought, it was Sherlock if there was Sherlock, otherwise, Heracles if there wasn't. With the Lion King here, why bother thinking? That would be redundant. Under the expectant gazes of everyone, Sherlock gave his assessment. "Interesting, Sherlock, what exactly do you find interesting?" This wasn't the first time Sherlock had made such a comment about Professor Lockhart. He said that before class even started, and Harry and Ron were about to ask when they were interrupted. Now that Sherlock had brought it up again, Ron simply asked once more. Professor Lockhart's behavior is interesting, but as for him personally, he's quite contradictory." "Contradictory? How so?" Hearing Sherlock begin to analyze Professor Lockhart, not only the little lions but even the badgers crowded around. Sherlock pondered for a moment, then lightly tapped the table with his long, slender fingers. "Did you all notice the first spell he cast when the house elf appeared?" Hearing Sherlock's words, the onlookers exchanged glances, then shook their heads. The classroom was in complete chaos at that moment. Who had the mind to pay attention to that? Not even Hermione, the top student, had noticed. "Sherlock, stop beating around the bush and just tell me. Your smile has completely given you away." Hearing Hermione's words, Sherlock chuckled and then explained directly. He said Pesca-Pixie, Pestronomy. Everyone exchanged puzzled glances. After a moment of stunned silence, someone couldn't help but ask, "So what does that mean?" Sherlock looked at Hermione. Although she didn't know why, Hermione understood what Sherlock meant. She then began to try to analyze it. On the surface, it doesn't seem to mean anything, but it feels like it can be analyzed and understood. However, all I can see right now is that pester means annoying, and that doesn't really explain anything, Hermione said somewhat helplessly. "Hermione, you've found the blind spot." Sherlock nodded and continued, "I think you remember the Mirror of Eris, right?" Seeing Hermione nod, Sherlock continued, "Actually, the sentence Professor Lockhart just recited can be rearranged like the description of the Mirror of Eris, only without the hassle of reversing the order." Harry and Ron exchanged glances, then stared blankly at Sherlock, completely bewildered. The others, who didn't even know what the Mirror of Eris was, were even more confused. What is all this about?" Only Hermione followed Sherlock's train of thought. After a moment's thought, her eyes lit up. "I know." She waved her wand and directly arranged the letters in a combination. "Professor Lockhart didn't say Pesca-Pixie, Pestronomy, but rather, Pesky pixie, pester no me. Pesky is actually pesky, which means annoying, and pester also means annoying. Pixie is a little elf, so if you put them together, it means annoying little elf. Don't bother me, Hermione excitedly announced her guess. Hermione, you certainly have a talent for summarizing and generalizing. Sherlock looked at her with satisfaction. This cobbled together spell, let's just call it a spell for now. Although I don't know why Professor Lockhart used it, it's obvious that the spell didn't achieve the desired effect. Only after that did he use the simpler yet more effective freezing charm. However, you might not have noticed that his expression was hesitant and his movements were strained when casting the spell. This was actually a sign of reluctance, even resistance, but the spell was successful, so why was he like this? The group of young wizards exchanged bewildered glances. Wouldn't it be better to successfully prove their abilities and deal with these annoying little elves? Why would they resist? That's exactly what I wanted to say, contradiction. His words, his actions, even everything he does are contradictory. It's not hard to deduce that he preferred his earlier, ambiguous spell to work, rather than the freezing spell that actually worked later. And there's something else. Sherlock paused, then, to the astonishment of the young wizards, continued, he showed obvious pleasure when he discovered his book had been torn to shreds by the elves. Pleasure. Hearing Sherlock's words, everyone was even more bewildered. No normal person would feel happy when their work is torn to pieces, right? What was this professor thinking? Sure enough, Sherlock was absolutely right. This new defense against the dark arts professor was rather contradictory, or rather awkward. But regardless, at least one thing was certain. He was indeed truly capable. When the young wizards learned from Hermione that Sherlock had made this deduction so early, they were once again filled with admiration for him. Their Lion King was not only brave, but also intelligent. This was truly rare. Unexpectedly, Sherlock surprised the class again during evening astronomy class. Compared to other courses, astronomy was more like a course offered in a Muggle school, as it didn't require the use of magic at all. This was similar to history of magic. However, unlike history of magic, which only required theory, this course also required practical application. As in the previous semester, astronomy professor Aurora Sinesta required all freshmen to observe the night sky with a telescope. In addition to learning the names of different stars, they also had to draw the orbits of planets. This placed considerable demands on the young wizards' drawing skills. Even though it was the same star chart, some people's drawings were much better than others. Let me test you first, to see if you've forgotten everything you learned last semester after the summer vacation. Upon hearing this, the young wizards all looked miserable. Was this for real? In just one afternoon, Professor Lockhart's teaching methods had already spread? How come even someone with thick eyebrows, big eyes, and thick lips was starting to give pre-class tests? Professor Sinesta ignored the resentful expressions of the young wizards and began her question directly. Name the 9 planets of the solar system in order of their distance from the sun, from closest to farthest. In fact, she had already asked this question last semester, and Hermione had answered it correctly then. A year later, she asked the same question again, but with a new condition. Unsurprisingly, Hermione was the first to raise her hand. And also the last. Professor Sinesta frowned slightly at this. Her gaze swept over the entire class. Every wizard she saw either lowered their head, looked away, or stared blankly, all fearing being called on by Professor Sinesta. Finally, Professor Sinesta's gaze passed over Hermione and landed on Sherlock beside her. Mr. Holmes, please answer this question. Hearing that Professor Sinesta had chosen Sherlock, the entire class was startled. They clearly remembered that in their first astronomy class in their first year, Professor Sinesta had chosen Sherlock and Hermione to answer a question. The reason was that they were both from Muggle families and had performed exceptionally well in all their courses at the beginning of the semester. Hermione was indeed as excellent as ever, correctly answering Professor Sinesta's question. But to their utter surprise, Sherlock gave them a shock. He didn't even know the basic fact that the Earth revolves around the sun. It was simply speechless. Unexpectedly, a year later, Professor Sinesta called on Sherlock again. Was this some kind of targeting? In fact, they weren't wrong. Professor Sinesta was indeed deliberately targeting Sherlock. Last year's first-year final exams consisted of 7 compulsory courses. Sherlock received OS in Transfiguration, Charms, Potions, and Herbalism, and his grades were ridiculously high, even surpassing Hermione, who was first in the year. However, He only received As in the other 3 courses: astronomy, history of magic, and defense against the dark arts. What was even more infuriating was that his scores in these 3 courses were just above the A threshold. It was as if getting even one more point would be a waste. This naturally displeased the professors who taught these 3 courses. Of course, Quirrell doesn't count, since he's gone and will never return. Professors Sinister and Binns originally planned to speak with Sherlock, but Dumbledore, as the headmaster, stopped them. But now that the new semester has begun, if Headmaster Dumbledore won't let me speak to him directly, surely giving him a lesson in class won't be a problem? Anyway, I'm just a woman, naturally petty. Even if Dumbledore finds out, what can he do to me? In short, she wants Sherlock to know that it's not just the courses taught by the 4 heads of the house who are important. Astronomy is equally important. Chapter 181. You have great talent, come fencing with me. When Professor Sinesta asked Sherlock a question, Ron immediately panicked. Hermione, why don't you tell Sherlock the answer? Otherwise, he'll just say this knowledge is useless again. Harry and Hermione exchanged a helpless glance. Did they think this was child's play? It might be possible before the question was asked, but now the teacher and the whole class were watching. How could they possibly do that? Besides, Hermione's eyes lit up with anticipation. Remembering the gift she'd brought Sherlock over the summer, she didn't think this question would stump him. Under the watchful eyes of Professor Sinesta and the entire class, Sherlock slowly stood up. Of the 9 planets, Mercury is the closest to the Sun, followed by Venus, then, and the farthest is Pluto. Following Professor Sinesta's instructions, Sherlock rattled off the names of the 9 planets in the solar system, from closest to farthest from the Sun. After he finished, the whole class was stunned. Professor Sinesta was also stunned. She never expected Sherlock to answer the question so fluently. After a moment's hesitation, she took a deep breath and decided to continue. What is the largest planet in the solar system? Jupiter, and the second, Saturn, and the third, the 9th, Pluto? Before she knew it, Professor Sinesta had asked about all 9 planets. Seeing Sherlock give the correct answer so easily once again, the young wizards in the class were even more surprised. Professor Sinesta, of course, was astonished. She looked at Sherlock in surprise, realizing with disbelief that this young wizard seemed to be quite different from last year. After a moment's thought, she simply asked a truly difficult question: what do Mars, Jupiter, and Venus represent in divination? Hearing this question, Hermione frowned. Strictly speaking, this question couldn't be considered part of astronomy. It was closer to an elective course they would be offering later, divination. Professor Sinesta's unusual questioning of Sherlock was already strange enough, but now she was suddenly asking such advanced questions, which left her completely bewildered. What was she doing? Was she picking a fight? But there was no reason. She couldn't help but look at Sherlock with some worry. Although Sherlock no longer thought astronomy was a useless subject, he might not be able to answer the question. Even if she were to recite the question in one breath, she would have to recall it before she could answer it. Sure enough, Sherlock, who had been answering so fluently just moments before, fell silent. Seeing this, Professor Sinister suddenly realized her mistake and couldn't help but feel a little regretful. What was she doing? Sherlock had already done very well, so why did she have to ask him these questions? She was a professor, how could she argue with a child? Sigh, it wasn't entirely her fault, mainly because Sherlock's behavior was too infuriating. She secretly made up her mind that even if Sherlock couldn't answer, she would still give Gryffindor extra points. Unexpectedly, Sherlock was silent for only a few seconds before giving his answer. Mars represents violence, conflict, and war, and rules Aries. Venus represents friendship, love, and harmony, and rules Taurus and Libra. Jupiter represents wisdom, protection, and luck, and rules Sagittarius. Everyone in the class was stunned, looking at Sherlock as if he were an alien. After a brief silence, Professor Sinister announced loudly, absolutely correct. Gryffindor, at 30 points, to make up for her earlier teasing of Sherlock, she generously added 30 points to his score. Once Sherlock was seated, Professor Sinister Strike's gaze swept over the entire class before she slowly began to speak. Today is your first astronomy class as second-year students, so I feel I should tell you a few things beforehand. Although astronomy is a course that doesn't require the use of any magic, Hogwarts has made it a compulsory course because it has extraordinary significance. I already mentioned this in the first class last year, and Mr. Holmes's answer just now perfectly illustrates this point. She glanced at Sherlock again, her eyes full of kindness. It not only cultivates your thinking abilities but also complements other magical subjects such as divination. I think you all already know that in 5th year, everyone must take the AL exams. What I want to say is, only students who achieve an E, exceeds expectations, or higher on the exams can continue studying this course in 6th and 7th year. After saying this, she glanced at Sherlock again before beginning the formal lesson. Sherlock, why are you suddenly interested in astronomy? Didn't you think this subject was useless? Ron asked quietly during a break in the professor's lecture. It's useful now. Why, my dear Ron, I think you've probably forgotten something. In the case of the Greek interpreter, it was precisely because of my astronomical knowledge that I was able to quickly find the criminal's hiding place in Nocturne Alley. Ron had indeed forgotten, but Sherlock's reminder brought it back to him. Oh, I see. He had a look of sudden realization, then his body tense up, and he said excitedly, "Great. Now I can copy your homework too." Ron had been suffering under Hermione's thumb for a long time, because Hermione never let him and Harry copy homework. Although she would always get the correct answers, after checking them, he would always get a lecture in the process. In this situation, it was naturally more straightforward to just copy Sherlock's homework. But Sherlock's attitude towards astronomy class last semester meant that Ron couldn't copy it. So in the end, he had to humble himself and beg Hermione. Now that Sherlock has declared he's going to study astronomy seriously, doesn't that mean I should start studying too? Thinking this, Ron puffed out his chest, his red hair seeming even more vibrant. Sherlock, after astronomy class, the young wizards were all exhausted, yawning and heading straight to their common room. Sherlock was no exception. This scene surprised his roommates. Sherlock, I thought you'd always be so energetic. I'm not Superman, my dear Ron. I've told you before, a person's energy is limited, and I only do this when I need to. Okay, whatever you say. I'm going to sleep, I'm so sleepy. Taking advantage of the others' inattention, Harry found an opportunity and asked Sherlock in a low voice, "Are we going to the Forbidden Forest again tonight?" Sherlock shook his head. The new term had officially begun, and like last year, he still needed to manage his time wisely. Judging from today's classes, going to the Forbidden Forest every night wasn't good for the long term. Besides his regular classes, he needed time to continue learning about the magical world. After all, home didn't offer the convenience of the Hogwarts library. To conserve his energy, he needed to proceed gradually. In short, the first day of the new term was perfect for Sherlock in every way. So the latest instruction was, sleep in. Nothing more was said that night. The next morning, Harry, true to his brotherly and loyal principles, called out to Ron again. "Ron, wake up. Hey, what are you doing? Get up, time for morning exercise. I had astronomy class last night and slept so late, let me get some sleep. Anyway, I don't have a class until 10, but didn't you say you'd go with us for morning exercise yesterday?" "Did I? Of course. Okay, not today. Next time for sure." Harry looked at Ron, who had pulled the blanket over his head, and sighed deeply. He shouldn't have believed his nonsense at all. Turning to look at Sherlock, who was already prepared, Harry awkwardly rubbed his nose. "Let's go." The morning practice the next day was similar to usual, basic training, boxing, and fencing. However, Sherlock had reduced the time spent on basic training, allocating more time to boxing and fencing. "Watch my movements, Harry." Sherlock, holding the natural straight wooden stick he had found the day before, began teaching from the most basic sword-holding posture. The correct posture allows you to attack more efficiently while reducing energy consumption. Beginners often unconsciously grip the hilt tightly when fencing, which is a waste. "Look, you're doing the same thing. Your knuckles are white." Harry nodded repeatedly, quickly relaxing as Sherlock instructed. To Sherlock's relief, just as he had observed last year, Harry indeed had a talent for fencing. After practicing a few times with him, he quickly grasped the essentials. He believed it wouldn't be long before he became a pro. After breakfast, the Gryffindor students went to their herbology class with the Hufflepuff students again. The lesson continued with the repotting mandrakes. According to Professor Sprout, this would be the main focus of herbology class for a long time to come. After all, there were quite a few mandrakes. It would take at least a month to complete this major task. The young wizards worked in groups of 4, immediately getting to work. With the experience from last time, Most of the young wizards successfully completed the task by the end of get out of class. This was a significant improvement over the previous lesson, which pleased Professor Sprout greatly. He even gave bonus points to Neville and Hannah for their outstanding performance in the practical exercise. The afternoon's transfiguration lesson was also about transforming beetles into buttons, nothing particularly new. However, this time, apart from Sherlock and Hermione, other young wizards finally successfully completed the transformation. Professor McGonagall's face broke into a rare smile. Chapter 182 Give It a Quick Death. As the headmaster of Ravenclaw House, renowned for his wisdom, Professor Felix Flitwick, the charms professor, was a man of great wit and humor. Coupled with his gentle nature and relatively undemanding attitude towards students, he was always a popular teacher among young wizards. However, because of his unusually small stature, only a little over a meter tall, he always had to stand on a stack of thick books to reach the podium. At this moment, the stack of books was slightly warped by his weight, the gold lettering on their spines shimmering faintly in the dim classroom light. Despite his small stature, Professor Flitwick possessed a commanding presence. For the first lesson of the new term, I originally planned to teach you the general counterspell. He paused here, his gaze sweeping over each student with sharp intensity. When he passed Sherlock and Harry, his gaze softened considerably, like a gentle breeze caressing a lake in spring. He raised his voice, speaking in a clear yet undeniably authoritative tone, "But now I've changed my mind." At this, the students immediately began to whisper among themselves, speculating about what had happened to make the professor change his lesson at the last minute. Harry instinctively looked at Sherlock beside him. Sherlock, he had originally intended to ask Sherlock if he knew why Professor Flitwick had suddenly changed his lesson. Before Harry could even finish calling out Sherlock's name, the latter, without looking up, said, "Professor Flitwick met with Professor Lockhart before entering the classroom." Harry was taken aback and was about to ask again when Hermione, standing nearby, exclaimed anxiously, "What? You just saw Professor Lockhart? Where is he?" "I didn't notice, dear Hermione. I haven't seen Professor Lockhart." "Then how do you know he met with Professor Flitwick?" "That's easy." Sherlock finally looked up and said in a rapid-fire voice, "When he entered the classroom, Professor Flitwick had a strong perfume scent. Even you could tell that this fragrance, a blend of rose, lavender, and a touch of lily of the valley, was Professor Lockhart's usual choice." Professor Flitwick's expression seemed calm, but his eyes were slightly red, and there was a lingering worry in his gaze. This indicated that he had experienced significant emotional fluctuations while talking to someone. Furthermore, there were several unnatural wrinkles on the left sleeve of his robe, signs of being pulled or strained. Combined with the content of our last defense against the dark arts class, the matter became clear. Before class, Professor Flitwick and Professor Lockhart had a frank conversation, exchanging opinions thoroughly, and ultimately Professor Flitwick changed his original teaching plan. Harry, Hermione, and Ron exchanged bewildered glances. No matter how many times similar things happened, whenever Sherlock explained his reasoning, their expressions were always almost identical. "Ah, so that's it." A sudden realization. A complete understanding. "I've heard about what happened in your defense against the dark arts class." Professor Flitwick's words immediately drew the attention of the entire class. Charms class was already one of the more interesting subjects, and now that Professor Flitwick had mentioned the currently popular defense against the dark arts, the young wizard's attention became even more focused. "For you all, this is something to celebrate. Hogwarts has finally found a qualified defense against the dark arts professor." Professor Flitwick's eyes flashed with a complex expression. He had initially been puzzled by Dumbledore's decision to appoint Lockhart as the defense against the dark arts professor. He was even more dismissive of Lockhart himself. After all, he knew all too well what Lockhart had done back in Ravenclaw. He never expected Lockhart to actually stage a triumphant return. From the very first defense against the dark arts class in his second year, his performance was commendable. Although there were still some minor flaws, the final result was far beyond his expectations. In the following classes, he became increasingly outstanding. Of course, this disregarded the ridiculous questionnaire and his self-praise. But regardless, even Flitwick, a dueling master, had to admit that Dumbledore had indeed given those of them who hadn't initially thought highly of Lockhart a pleasant surprise. Thinking of this, Professor Flitwick's expression grew increasingly serious. "But it's really hard to accept that a mere group of Cornish elves could make you all run away in terror. Just now, Professor Lockhart came to me and questioned my teaching methods. Professor Flitwick's face showed slight displeasure. If it were anyone else offering suggestions on his teaching methods, even a student, he wouldn't be so angry. But it had to be Lockhart. What made it even more frustrating was that he had to admit Lockhart was right. Thinking this, he took a deep breath. In that case, I'll teach you the freezing charm today. When the young wizards heard Professor Flitwick say he would teach the freezing charm, they immediately cheered. Everything from the defense against the dark arts class was still vivid in their minds. A group of young wizards trembled under Professor Lockhart's protection. Professor Lockhart, however, cast a freezing charm again and again, knocking those menacing elves down from the sky. Almost every young wizard who witnessed this scene shared the same thought: they hoped to one day be as impressive as Professor Lockhart. It was wonderful that Professor Lockhart had acted so quickly. Of course, Professor Flitwick, who accepted Professor Lockhart's suggestion, was also quite admirable. Professor Flitwick was pleased with the young wizard's enthusiasm. He cleared his throat and began to teach the theory. The freezing charm is an offensive spell. As the name suggests, once successfully cast, it can immediately stop a person or thing from moving, as if it were frozen. As for its actual effect, I think you've already seen it clearly in your defense against the dark arts classes. First, let's learn the incantation for the freezing charm, Immobilis. Compared to the levitation charm's incantation Wingardium Leviosa, the freezing charm's incantation Immobilis is much simpler. The former is a life-related spell, while the latter is an offensive spell, thus requiring a higher level of mental strength from the wizard. Fortunately, after practicing defense against the dark arts, the young wizards had deeply realized the importance of this spell, so concentrating their mental strength wasn't a problem. After the theoretical knowledge was finished, it was time for the long-awaited practice. Neville's Accio. As Professor Flitwick waved his wand and chanted the arrival charm, a bewildered Neville hadn't even reacted before his pet toad Accio was successfully summoned again. Just like the levitation charm class before Halloween last semester, everyone looked up, watching Accio fly around the classroom. Then, freezing cold, as Professor Flitwick waved his wand again, Accio, who was still floating in the air, froze, like a scene frozen in time in a movie, and fell straight down from the sky. Everyone, pay attention to my movements, and don't forget that subtle wrist twitch. Also, I'll emphasize again, your pronunciation must be clear. After all, I don't want to see you lying on the ground after waving your wands, just like last semester. Once the practice began, Professor Flitwick divided the class into pairs for training. Sherlock's partner was Seamus, Hermione's partner was Neville, and Harry and Ron formed the Harry-Ron duo. After a whole school year of lessons, Professor Flitwick had gained considerable experience. For Seamus Finnegan, it was best to have Sherlock or Hermione mentor him. They were among the few students who could cover for the demolition expert. As for the other person, they could mentor those less gifted wizards who didn't have a high success rate when using spells, such as Neville, Longbottom, and Roundface. This way, he could save a lot of trouble and focus his time and energy on more people. Professor Flitwick was unaware that many young wizards had practiced a freezing charm for a while after the last defense against the dark arts class. Even so, very few wizards were able to cast it in this lesson. Even fewer succeeded on their first try. Of course, Sherlock and Hermione were exceptions. They each earned 10 points from Gryffindor. Harry also succeeded after several attempts, but because it wasn't a one-shot, Professor Flitwick didn't award him any points. Seamus, in Sherlock's group, waved and flicked his wand repeatedly, but nothing happened. Frustrated, Seamus accidentally changed his accent while chanting the spell, predictably causing an explosion. The expressionless Sherlock, prepared, used the freezing charm Professor Flitwick had just taught him to resolve the trouble. It was a kind of live demonstration. "Sorry, Holmes, I don't know what's wrong with me. I always end up making a mess." Sherlock looked at Seamus with an embarrassed expression, remaining silent. He was also pondering this question. Could it really be genetic? Even practicing the freezing charm could cause an explosion? Perhaps he could consider having him specialize in the explosion charm. Hermione and Neville were in similar situations. Neville was making failed attempts time and time again. Hermione, like a teacher, was correcting his pronunciation and movements, appearing very assertive and bluntly stating, "The correct pronunciation of Immobilis is vowels, the M must be emphasized." If it were Ron, he would definitely retort, "If you can do it, then you do it." Neville, on the other hand, nodded meekly, indicating that he understood. However, this was of little use. Neville's talent in charms was far inferior to his talent in herbalism. Despite practicing diligently, mastering a completely new charm in a single lesson was still beyond his capabilities. However, thanks to Hermione's careful guidance and his own relentless efforts, he finally made some progress before the end of Get Out of Class. He succeeded, but not completely. His pet toad, named Raffer, was frozen in place by his freezing charm, its eyes and two front legs motionless, while its two hind legs twitched violently. The frequency of its kicks made Hermione's eyelids twitch. She simply swung her wand down, giving it a quick death. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 183 They've Lost All Shame. Sorry, Granger, I don't know what happened. I always end up like this by accident. Hermione wasn't angry at Neville's apology, which was just like Seamus's. She found it rather amusing. Now that practice was over, Hermione wasn't as fierce as before. She earnestly said to Neville, "It's okay. With your abilities, it's normal not to master it the first time. You've already done very well, really, of course, as long as you're willing to work hard, you'll eventually succeed." Yes, I'll try." Perhaps afraid of being tormented by Neville again, Raffer jumped away after Hermione broke the spell. So, after saying this to Hermione, Neville hurriedly ran to catch it. Watching Neville, beaming, run to the corner of the classroom chasing the toad, Ron couldn't help but say, "With your abilities, it's normal not to master it the first time. Hermione, you really know how to talk." Luckily it's Neville, anyone else would probably be yelling at you by now, right? Hell, Ronald, are you talking about yourself? Ahem. Well, Hermione isn't wrong. Just as Ron was trying to cover his embarrassment with a cough, Sherlock suddenly interjected. Hermione looked at Sherlock in surprise, not expecting him to speak up for her. "I don't think you should deceive others just because you can talk. That would give them a wrong impression of you," Ron said, puzzled. "So what? It's not a big deal, is it?" "You're wrong, Ron," Sherlock said bluntly. Self-awareness is a precise scientific instrument that needs daily calibration. Have you ever seen a competent clockmaker assemble a nautical chronometer with rusty gears? Whether in the magical world or the muggle world, accurate insight into one's own abilities is always the key to clearing away the fog and avoiding danger. Clearly measuring the boundaries of one's abilities is the most reliable talisman. He paused, his gaze sweeping across Ron's face. For you, it means never trying to bite food that is far beyond your chewing ability. Ron, degree, I was indeed wrong. When it comes to not being able to talk, Hermione is far inferior to Sherlock. Sherlock's insightful words also surprised his friends. Unbeknownst to them, Sherlock spoke these words because he was reminded of the case of the Greek interpreter. Back then, he had overestimated his abilities and nearly missed a crucial clue. If Hermione hadn't happened to decipher the star map, Hagrid's interpreter friend would likely have met the same fate as Musgrave. That's why he made his change afterward. For an 11 or 12-year-old, Sherlock Holmes still had a lot of room to grow. Thanks to Hermione's consistent performance as the top scorer, Gryffindor's red hourglass, used to measure scores, had been far ahead since the start of the school year. This kept Professor McGonagall beaming with joy every day. Since Harry arrived at school, not only had he broken Slytherin's monopoly on the House Cup, but Quidditch had also improved, and everything seemed to be getting better. However, this momentum came to an abrupt halt during Wednesday morning potions class. In the second year, professors not only added more points but also deducted them more drastically. This was particularly evident in Professor Severus Snape's case. The first potions class of the second year was supposed to be just a review of the previous semester's material, but Professor Snape still easily found a reason to deduct points. "Potter, why won't you write down what I just said?" Because of your arrogance, Gryffindor lost 10 points. After the familiar Harry Potter deducts 10 points routine, both Gryffindor and Slytherin felt a sense of familiarity. This was potions class. This was Professor Snape. This was the real Hogwarts. They're back, they're all back. Especially for the Slytherin students, this scene was particularly important. Long before classes officially started, Professor Snape had convened a general meeting of all Slytherin students and faculty. The meeting was chaired by Head of House Severus Snape. The meeting stated that, given the Slytherin students' poor performance during the pre-semester inspection, this meeting was convened to unify thinking, raise awareness, and further strengthen the overall quality of all students and faculty. The meeting emphasized that during the previous semester, some students were not actively participating in discussions and exhibited a lazy, complacent attitude. A very small number of students engaged in unfair competition in Quidditch matches, seriously damaging the house's image. Even worse, some knowingly challenged others despite their own limitations, causing the house to lose significant points. The meeting demanded that at the start of the new semester, all faculty and students deeply recognize their shortcomings, adhere to a problem-oriented approach, and make every effort to address their weaknesses, welcoming the new semester with a fresh perspective. The attending faculty and students unanimously agreed that Professor Snape's speech was insightful, profound yet easy to understand, and highly targeted and instructive. All faculty and students will use this meeting as an opportunity to start strong and fight hard for a successful beginning. At the end of the previous semester, Slytherin suffered a last-minute upset, losing their chance for a 7th consecutive House Cup title. From that moment on, most Slytherin students harbored resentment. Especially for the graduating 7th-year students, losing this championship meant losing a significant highlight of their resumes. 7 consecutive championships. That perfectly covered a student's entire career from entering to leaving the school. Since entering the school, through my unremitting efforts, my house has won the House Cup for 7 consecutive years. Such a prestigious statement on their resume was gone with Gryffindor's rise to power. Just thinking about it was heartbreaking. Therefore, Slytherin House, from top to bottom, was determined to reclaim the House Cup this year no matter what. After the all-house assembly, the Slytherins put in all their effort, intending to widen the score gap with the other houses when school started. Unfortunately, Gryffindor's top scorer started racking up points without warning, catching them off guard. So they waited for an opportunity. Until now. Professor Snape's deduction of points from Gryffindor in potions class officially sounded the charge. In the following lessons, Professor Snape continued his scoring spree, racking up numerous points. The announcement of Gryffindor minus 10 points echoed repeatedly. Meanwhile, the students, who had prepared beforehand, eagerly answered questions, with Draco Malfoy and Pansy Parkinson even teaming up to snatch 50 points from Professor Snape. Near the end of Get Out of Class, Seamus caused a small explosion due to a mishap. Fortunately, Sherlock intervened in time, preventing any harm to others. Professor Snape's gaze swept coldly over Sherlock, his black robes billowing, his fingertips tapping the stone wall with a crackling sound. "Great Detective Sherlock Holmes, your smug expression is truly repulsive. Do you think waving your wand can compensate for your pathetic judgment? Remember this, spilled water cannot be taken back. As for you, Mr. Seamus Finnegan, due to your impulsiveness, stupidity, and recklessness, Gryffindor has lost another 10 points. With this final blow, by the end of potions class, Gryffindor's previously commanding lead was abruptly halted. In contrast, Slytherin had caught up rapidly, almost on par with the Gryffindor. Slytherin is going too far. They've completely lost all sense of shame, Ron said indignantly after class. I think they must have conspired with the old bat. The old bat told them the questions beforehand, then let them raise their hands to answer and get the points. Look at the Chrome Prince and the Porco Rosso, their mouths are practically stretched to their cheeks. Chrome Prince was a nickname Sherlock gave Draco Malfoy, and it had become widely known in Gryffindor since it was first used. As for the Porco Rosso, it was simply Ron's objective description of Pansy Parkinson's appearance. However, he only criticized the Slytherin students' methods of gaining points, without mentioning Snape's deductions. After all, in his opinion, it would be strange if Professor Snape didn't find fault with a Gryffindor and deduct points. Unexpectedly, even this level of complaint was dismissed without hesitation by Sherlock. No, my dear Ron, your feeling is wrong, huh? The Slytherin students didn't know the questions beforehand, they were only able to answer Professor Snape's questions correctly because they had all done thorough preparation. Although Professor Snape might use some underhanded reasons to deduct points and ignore other houses, specifically targeting Slytherin students, his pride would never allow him to reveal the questions to his students beforehand. All the young wizards who heard Sherlock's words looked surprised. They hadn't expected Sherlock to speak up for Professor Snape. Impossible. Absolutely impossible, Ron shook his head repeatedly. Sherlock, you must be wrong this time. Those Slytherin guys aren't you and Hermione, How could they possibly know the correct answer every time? The old bat must have told them the questions he wanted to ask beforehand. No, maybe even the answers. My dear Ron, if you trust my judgment, you should understand that I can read their true thoughts from their expressions. At this point, Sherlock turned to Hermione. My dear Hermione, I think you remember asking me about my opinion of Edgar Allan Poe before, right? Thanks to reader 20230228120925692 for the 100 Kidian coins reward. Your support is my motivation to update. Chapter 184. Is it really that hard to acknowledge someone else's excellence? Of course I remember. Although she didn't understand why Sherlock suddenly brought this up, Hermione nodded. Very good. Edgar Allan Poe once said in a short story that the protagonist deduced the unspoken thoughts of his companions by observing their actions, such as tripping over a stone or looking up at the stars. This is exactly the same line of reasoning I used to deduce that Professor Snape hadn't informed the Slytherin students of the questions beforehand. I noticed the subtle expressions and hesitations of the Slytherin students when answering questions, just like the person in the story who grasped the clues in their companion's behavior. Hermione paused for a moment, then slowly nodded. Indeed, the logic is very similar. Both start from seemingly insignificant details, observing behavior to analyze the underlying thought process. At this point, she couldn't help but recall Sherlock's disdain and contempt when she first mentioned Edgar Allan Poe. After a year of getting to know him, she realized that Sherlock wasn't exaggerating at all. Compared to characters created by Edgar Allan Poe or Agatha Christie, Sherlock truly seemed like a detective straight out of a novel. More importantly, he was only 12 years old. The young detective has a lot of room to grow. The conversation between the two left the young wizards looking bewildered. Those with such broad knowledge as Hermione are ultimately a minority. Even among Muggle families, few already know detective novels and the name Edgar Allan Poe at this age, let alone wizarding families with almost no Muggle knowledge. Ron frowned and said, although I don't know who you're talking about, it sounds like this is just a gimmick made up by that author. Like Lockhart, it's all just to grab attention. Dear Ron, Sherlock said, I wasn't originally planning to say this, but since you've brought it up, I'll share my reasoning. Under the watchful eyes of the group of young lions, Sherlock directly explained his reasoning. Whether it's Malfoy or the other Slytherin students, when they heard the question, most of them showed a brief expression of surprise before falling into thought. For example, Malfoy's eyebrows rose slightly, and his eyes revealed a hint of surprise, indicating that he didn't know he would be asked this question beforehand. If they had known the question beforehand, they should have had a more confident and composed expression, rather than the surprise and momentary fluster. Also, their answers weren't very fluent. There were some pauses and hesitations. For example, when that young lady answered the question about the potion's ingredients, she paused for a few seconds before slowly giving her answer, and even stuttered slightly during the process. If they knew the questions beforehand and prepared their answers, they should be able to answer more fluently and quickly. Furthermore, I think you may not have noticed that the Slytherin students exchanged glances before answering questions. This indicates that they were not entirely sure of their answers and needed hints or support from their peers. Based on these facts, it's not difficult to deduce the conclusion I just made. As for your point, in fact, it's not difficult to do this, you just need to read the book beforehand. The young wizards looked at each other, some believing, some doubting, and some simply not understanding. Harry, of course, had complete faith in Sherlock, but Ron frowned. Just read the book beforehand. Easier said than done. How many people can actually do that? Is it so hard to admit someone else is better? Hermione decisively sided with Sherlock. Ronald, just because you can't do it doesn't mean others can't. But you did raise your hand, but the old bat just wouldn't call on you. Ron, choosing which student to answer a question in class is the teacher's prerogative. Ron couldn't argue with Sherlock alone, let alone with Hermione chiming in. Although he still didn't believe Sherlock, he couldn't say anything more and changed the subject. He patted Seamus on the shoulder, comforting him. Hey, don't worry, my old friend, Hermione will make up for the points we lost in other subjects. Sherlock raised an eyebrow. Ron's thoughts naturally didn't escape his notice. Seeing that Ron remained unconvinced despite his silence, Sherlock secretly decided to find an opportunity to teach him a lesson. Meanwhile, Seamus, with a mournful face, heard Sherlock's words of comfort. You're right, but it's pointless. Professor Snape will just deduct the points from Harry again. Everyone exchanged bewildered glances. You're absolutely right, they thought. I'm speechless. Actually, I don't think we need to care too much about the grades." Just then, Neville, who had finally managed to catch Raffer, joined in. He had been listening to the discussion silently until everyone fell silent. Then he weakly raised a hand and said, "Last semester we were so far behind, but we still managed to get our points back, didn't we?" After a brief silence, everyone burst into laughter. "Ho ha ho ha, well said, Neville. So you're going to pass this difficult task on to the Lion King and the Savior again?" "No, I didn't." "Don't talk nonsense." Neville and Seamus waved their hands erratically, as if afraid of being misunderstood. "All right, Neville." Ron affectionately put his arm around Neville's shoulder. "You know, Headmaster Dumbledore gave us so many extra points last semester because we protected the Philosopher's Stone. You don't really think this semester will be like last semester, with another dangerous situation requiring us to deal with it, do you?" Even Seamus, who had just felt guilty about losing points, laughed. "Yeah, Neville, if that happened, Hogwarts would become Azkaban, but, don't worry, if that happens again this semester, I'll make sure I can't find a girlfriend before I'm 20. 15, Ron was about to blurt it out when he suddenly remembered Sherlock stabbing Quirrell in the waist last semester. Although he felt it was unlikely to happen again this semester, better safe than sorry, so he lowered the age this time as a precaution. A cautious approach. The afternoon's history of magic class was no different from last semester. Ghost lectures, full of nonsense. Professor Binns was a teacher even Hermione, the top scorer, struggled with it, because he never asked questions. To make matters worse, his lectures were dry and boring, and his ghostly voice was incredibly soporific. So most young wizards treated history of magic like a hypnotic lesson. Only Sherlock seemed to be really engaged. "Sherlock, I really admire you." Harry turned to Sherlock, looking at him with admiration. "How can you listen so attentively to such a boring lesson?" He glanced at Hermione slowly as he spoke. Maintaining her alertness and avoiding falling asleep was already a testament to her academic prowess. Hearing Harry's heartfelt praise, Sherlock smiled happily. "My dear Harry, I've solved countless mysteries by following the slightest clues, relying on my familiarity with past cases. History's the same in the magical world. It's like a silent yet powerful mentor, teaching us to understand the development of the magical world. This is especially true for wizards like us who have never been exposed to magic before and come from Muggle families." Harry nodded thoughtfully. Hearing Sherlock and Harry chatting, Ron suddenly felt wide awake. He looked at Sherlock, his face full of curiosity, and said, "Old Sherlock, you only got an A in History of Magic last year, just like me. Does that mean you're going to study history of magic like you did in astronomy?" "Ron, times have changed," Sherlock said quietly. "I did say before that I would only learn what was useful to me, but after the Greek interpreter case, I changed my mind. In the magical world, much knowledge only reveals its usefulness when you use it. If you don't understand a subject at all, you won't even know what it can do, so you're planning to abandon your idea that the brain is just an attic." "My dear Hermione, even now, I still believe that the brain is a blank attic, and you need to regularly clean out the useless garbage. For example, after reading Professor Lockhart's works, I'll remember his adventures, but I won't remember his favorite color." "Hermione." Harry and Ron exchanged a glance at Hermione's frustrated look and couldn't help but chuckle. Sure enough, only Sherlock could control Hermione. After class, seeing Ron laughing incessantly, Harry couldn't help but elbow him. "Ron, what are you laughing at?" "I remembered something happy." "What's so happy about it?" "Besides astronomy class, I can now copy Sherlock's History of Magic homework." Ho ha, Harry, Ron. Oh, on the third night of school, Sherlock ventured into the Forbidden Forest alone for the second time. Unfortunately, this time he didn't encounter the grateful unicorn. Fortunately, the journey was still smooth and fruitful. He not only saw some new magical plants and animals, further enhancing his theoretical understanding of practical application, but also uncovered much of the Forbidden Forest map in fog during his second exploration. However, without the unicorn's help, he returned to his dormitory later than before. Back in his dormitory, Sherlock went straight to sleep. This was also within his expectations. After all, the Forbidden Forest is so vast, it's impossible to encounter a unicorn every time by chance. Even if he did encounter one, it might not be the one he had saved before. Therefore, adjusting the frequency of trips to the Forbidden Forest to once every 3 days is quite necessary. Even the greatest detective needs sufficient rest to maintain his stamina. Chapter 185 The Badger Infiltrates the Lion Pride. As time went by, Sherlock's routine gradually became more regular. Every morning, he would take Harry to practice boxing and swordplay, nurturing the savior of the wizarding world towards a melee wizard. After breakfast, he would attend classes on time, no longer missing individual classes like he had the previous year. Every 3 evenings, he would go to the Forbidden Forest to continuously supplement and improve the map of the Forbidden Forest in the memory attic. As for weekends, he would spend time in the library with Hermione, further deepening his understanding of the wizarding world. It could be said that, apart from the evening trips to the Forbidden Forest, his routine was almost identical to the previous term. If there was any difference, it would be the Defense Against the Dark Arts course. Last year, he only attended 2 of Quirrell's classes before starting to skip them, only promising Professor McGonagall that he would no longer miss them after helping Harry join the Quidditch team. This year, however, he hadn't missed a single Defense Against the Dark Arts class. Professor Gilderoy Lockhart's performance had already become known throughout Hogwarts. Besides Sherlock's second year, his performance in Defense Against the Dark Arts classes in other years was also remarkable. Just like the freezing spell used against elves, the spells he cast in class were often simple, direct, and quick to solve problems. All the students were astonished. They seemed to have truly encountered a competent Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Even the professors who had initially been extremely displeased with him toned down their intense hatred somewhat. They didn't completely suppress it because Professor Lockhart made sure everyone complete that ridiculous little quiz on their first day of class with each year's student. Except for the last few questions, most were short answer questions more akin to the Lockhart Research Society than Defense Against the Dark Arts. Undoubtedly, no one except Hermione could finish the test. Even though there were quite a few young witches who idolized Lockhart like Hermione, they couldn't possibly remember all of his quizzes. Not even one person could answer the last, serious part of the test perfectly like Sherlock. Before each formal lesson, Professor Lockhart would display his most charming smile. Even after the lesson began, he would still intersperse his lectures with tales of his adventures from the books. For the boys, it was utterly unbelievable. So greasy, just so incredibly greasy. But for the girls, it was quite the opposite. They generally believed that it was precisely because of Professor Lockhart's fantastical adventures in the books that this handsome and dashing Defense Against the Dark Arts professor became more relatable and perfect. As for the older young wizards, they were very satisfied with Professor Lockhart, both boys and girls. They dared not ask for more. They truly dared not. Hogwarts had had more perfect Defense Against the Dark Arts professors than Professor Lockhart. Before Sherlock's generation of young wizards entered the school, some Defense Against the Dark Arts professors were even more capable than Professor Lockhart. Take the Cornish elves, for example. Even if there were twice as many elves, those professors wouldn't have made the situation so chaotic. With their abilities, they could certainly have maintained order while allowing the young wizards to practice. Of course, some of Professor Lockhart's fans have started to defend him, saying that he did it intentionally, just to give the young wizards a chance to practice. This argument has gained considerable traction. After that Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, Professor Lockhart was able to maintain control in his subsequent classes. He even brought in creatures far more troublesome and dangerous than house elves, including some classified by the Department of Magic as being of extremely high levels, such as chameleons, hairy goblins, elfins, kappa, and kelpies. Even so, his classes never again saw the chaos that plagued house elves. As the course progressed, his performance seemed increasingly adept. Under these circumstances, Professor Lockhart's reputation naturally improved, especially with Quirrell's performance from the previous year serving as a cautionary tale. However, for the older young wizards, this wasn't the most important issue. The crucial problem was that since they arrived at Hogwarts, the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor had changed every year. Although Voldemort was gone, the curse he left behind remained. This frequent turnover made truly capable wizards unwilling to teach anymore. After all, nobody wants to end up with things like a wife divorcing them and taking half their assets, or suddenly falling ill because it's just a job. Even if a Defense Against the Dark Arts professor is incredibly skilled, what's the point if they only teach for a year and then leave? So having a Defense Against the Dark Arts professor like Gilderoy Lockhart who can teach them real skills is already incredibly good. Compared to his strengths, his weaknesses are negligible. Therefore, they didn't forget to remind their juniors to cherish their time together. Lockhart, use him while you can. Harry, where did you hear all this from? Ron looked incredulous when Harry recounted these things in detail. Why haven't I heard anything about this? Oh, Cho told me all of this. You mean Cho Chang? When did you become so close to her? I ran into her yesterday when I was doing morning exercises with Sherlock, so we chatted for a bit. Harry blushed slightly as he said this. Since the start of this term, his relationship with Cho Chang had become even better than last term. The two already had a lot in common, and this has only increased since Cho Chang officially became the chaser for the Ravenclaw Quidditch Academy this year. Hermione snorted, a hint of dissatisfaction in her voice. Professor Lockhart graduated from Ravenclaw, the house with the highest percentage of girls, so they're bound to be his biggest supporters. Unfortunately, even in Ravenclaw, no one has broken my perfect score record. Not now, and not ever. Because Professor Lockhart's first classes for all 7 years are over. That's hard to say, Hermione, Ron said irritably. Maybe this professor will come up with something new. Don't forget, last time he made us memorize huge passages of his amazing feats in the book. With proper preparation, getting a perfect score on that kind of test isn't difficult. That's true, but it's meaningless, because so far only I've managed it. That's because nobody bothers to do it. Ron was shocked. Dude, what are you so smug about? Is that something to be proud of? HMPH, I think you're just jealous. I'm jealous of him? Are you kidding me? Why would I be jealous of him? Of course it's because, shut up. Just as the two were arguing, Sherlock suddenly spoke up. You're disturbing my thinking. Upon hearing Sherlock's words, the two immediately turned away, refusing to speak to each other. However, Hermione quickly pulled Sherlock back into discussion about the knowledge points in 1,000 magical herbs and mushrooms. Harry and Ron, standing nearby, exchanged a glance and shrugged. They were already used to this. Compared to the first-year curriculum, the second-year curriculum was indeed more difficult, but not by much. As time went on, the young wizards gradually adapted. However, there were differences in ability among the students. Take Gryffindor students as an example. Sherlock and Hermione were able to quickly get into the swing of things at the beginning of the school year, performing with ease in every class. Adaptation period? What is an adaptation period? Harry and Ron, on the other hand, needed a short period of 2 to 3 days to adapt, and within a week they had fully recovered. It took Seamus and Dean a whole week to adjust, and then another weekend at school, before they were finally back to normal life after summer vacation. As for Neville, he's still completely bewildered. Potter, why didn't you remind Mr. Longbottom to wait until the potion in the cauldron was completely cooled before stirring? Did you think his mistake would make you look good? Because of your mistake, Gryffindor lost another 10 points. I'm sorry, Potter. After class, Neville apologized to Harry with a look of annoyance. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have been scolded by Professor Snape. It's not your fault. Harry comforted him. Even if you did nothing, Professor Snape would still have deducted points from me. But, I really forgot to wait until the potion was cooled before stirring. Just remember next time, Holmes. You're absolutely right. Neville looked at Sherlock with a mournful face. But I just can't remember. Neville, if you ask me, you shouldn't worry about these details. Just like Harry said, even without you, the old bat would have found other reasons to deduct points. Potter, who told you to stir the potion with your left hand? Gryffindor loses 10 points. Ron's imitation of Snape was spot on, and his first words filled the air with a cheerful atmosphere. Seeing everyone laughing, but Neville still looking sullen, Hermione comforted him. It's all right, Neville, you'll get those points back from Professor Lockhart's class soon. Hermione had her reasons. By now, Professor Lockhart's defense against the dark arts course had become a fixed routine. At the start of class, he'd display his charming smile, boasting about his past adventures. Then, the lesson would begin, with students reading aloud and reciting long passages from his own works with great expression. After the recitation, the young wizards would then participate in reenacting his adventures from the books. This was euphemistically called a classic scene reenactment. This left everyone utterly exasperated. Come on, this was defense against the dark arts, not a stage play. But it was precisely because of this element that Professor Lockhart had taken a liking to Neville. In his eyes, Neville Longbottom was clearly a badger cub who had infiltrated a pride of lions, docile, obedient, and lacking any desire to perform. Only Neville's clumsy mannerisms, befitting his role as a werewolf, vampire, or ghost, could truly showcase his regal bearing. Because of this, Neville consistently earned Gryffindor a significant number of points in defense against the dark arts, even more than in his best subject, herbalism. This was truly an unexpected bonus. Chapter 186 Neville, Miss Hannah, please be gentle. Due to certain special circumstances, Neville Longbottom grew up with his grandmother. However, as a member of one of the 28 holy pure-blood families, for a long time, his family considered him a squib, someone born into a wizarding family but without magical talent. Of course, this was later proven false. Neville was, after all, a wizard. However, after receiving his Hogwarts acceptance letter and entering the school, his performance was less than satisfactory. He was slow to react, had a poor memory, and was introverted and shy. For a long time, he even wondered if the Sorting Hat had made a mistake and shouldn't have placed him in Gryffindor. As for his performance at school, he was not only inferior to top students like Harry and Ron, but also to average junior wizards like Seamus and Dean. His grades hovered around the passing mark. The only subject he was truly outstanding in was herbology, which was both an interest and a talent. Therefore, he never imagined that someone like him would one day become a highly sought-after student by a professor. Even more unbelievable was that the professor was the defense against the dark arts professor. As the school bell rang, Professor Lockhart began his three-part routine. First, he boasted about his adventures. Next, he checked students' memorization of the text. Then came the reenactment of a classic scene. The lesson was mainly based on the textbook Walking with Trolls. Professor Lockhart unhesitatingly chose Neville as his assistant to play the troll he defeated, according to the book. Neville was already very familiar with this role. He performed naturally, without any difficulty. After the performance, as the lead actor, he would earn a lot of house points for Gryffindor. This made him worship Professor Lockhart, becoming one of the few boys who were as fanatical as the little witches. After finding Neville, Professor Lockhart selected several Hufflepuff students to play supporting roles. What followed was a stage play of about half an hour, perfectly recreating the scene he described in the book. Oh no! The trolls are about to attack the village. What? Quick, go get Mr. Lockhart. Don't worry, Chieftain. With Sir Lockhart, a third-class Order of Merlin, an honorary member of the Anti-Dark Magic League, and a 5-time winner of the Most Charming Smile Award from Wizarding Weekly, these trolls are nothing. Great. Mr. Lockhart, the village is so fortunate to have you, Mr. Lockhart is so handsome, Mr. Lockhart, I want to have your children. Aside from the young wizards playing roles on stage and Professor Lockhart's admirers, everyone else was either dozing off or speechless. Professor Lockhart, however, seemed oblivious, nodding with satisfaction. You all did a great job, very good. 10 points for each student who cooperated, and 30 points for Longbottom. Sparse applause rang out, the perfunctory nature of the applause obvious. Next, I'll show you how I defeated the trolls. Upon hearing Professor Lockhart's words, the students who had been dozing off immediately woke up. The entire class focused their attention on the podium. Everyone knew that this was the most crucial part of Professor Lockhart's defense against the dark arts course. It was also the fundamental reason why the young wizards were willing to cooperate with Professor Lockhart's antics and persevere to the end. Although the professor spent most of each lesson acting out scenes from novels, he always taught the young wizards some real skills at the very end. Listen up, everyone. Although our classmate Longbottom looks quite strong, he's still a far cry from a real troll. So, Mr. Longbottom, please cast a shield charm on yourself first. I already demonstrated this spell for you in the Wandering with Werewolves lesson. Hearing Professor Lockhart's words, Neville drew his wand and chanted a spell, attempting to cast an armor charm on himself. Unfortunately, due to his lack of mastery of the armor charm, he failed several times in a row. Tisk tisk, Mr. Longbottom. This won't do. If you were fighting a troll, you would probably be dead countless times by now. Professor Lockhart shook his head and said regretfully, I clearly taught you this in the last lesson. It seems you didn't review it carefully after class, did you? I'm sorry, Professor, Neville said with a mournful face. I really did learn it, but, alright, stop making that innocent face. Miss Abbott, who's standing over there playing the bystander, please cast the armor charm on Mr. Longbottom. Okay, Hannah Abbott, surprised that she, an extra, had a role, paused for a moment before stepping forward and drawing her wand, aiming it at Neville. Neville, seeing this, became even more nervous. Miss Hannah, please be gentle, don't worry, Mr. Longbottom, Hannah reassured Neville. seeing his anxious expression. "I'll take responsibility." With that, she chanted the spell. Protego. The next moment, a blue light emanated from the tip of Hannah's wand, shooting straight at Neville. A direct hit. Excellent, Hufflepuff plus 10. Professor Lockhart was very satisfied with Hannah Abbott's performance. "Now, let me show you how we dealt with the werewolves." His gaze swept around, and as he spoke, he slowly drew his wand, aiming it at Neville. At that moment, the entire class's attention was focused on Professor Lockhart and Neville. Students in the back rows even stood up, eager to see Professor Lockhart's next move. Neville, on the other hand, trembled even more violently. Professor Lockhart was very satisfied with his performance, then drew his wand and struck him. Stupefy, Neville didn't fall to the ground. Just as the wand was about to touch Neville's body, the Stupefy charm cast by Professor Lockhart suddenly deflected, bouncing to the side. This was expected, and it was precisely why Professor Lockhart had Hannah Abbott cast the armor charm on Neville. Judging from the current situation, Hannah was indeed very responsible. The armor charm was confirmed to be effective. However, no one, including Professor Lockhart, had expected that the charm, deflected to the side, would strike Hannah squarely. With a flash of light, a cry of "ouch" was heard. With a thud, Hannah collapsed to the ground, unconscious, before she could even react. Silence fell. Even Professor Lockhart was stunned. This was far too dramatic. It was completely unexpected. However, having weathered many storms, he quickly recovered and began to explain. "Did everyone see clearly? I consciously reduced the strength of the spell. This allowed Miss Abbott's ironclad charm to defend against it. Even so, my unfathomable magical power was still too overwhelming for you, which is why Miss Abbott fell unconscious." The students were already used to Professor Lockhart's tendency to boast whenever he had the chance. But for the little witches, Professor Lockhart's performance just now was simply too cool. So when they heard this, they couldn't help but cheer loudly. Even amidst such cheers, Hannah Abbott remained lying on the podium, completely unaware of what was happening. Professor Lockhart was very satisfied with everyone's reaction. He coughed and continued, "In fact, when you face trolls, the situation you face is actually quite similar to this. Your own magic is not strong enough, and the opponent has a certain degree of magical resistance. Relying on a stunning charm to defeat the opponent is unrealistic. In this situation, you need to use a more powerful spell. I encountered a similar situation when I cast a stunning charm on the troll. By the way, the invisibility shield created by the ironclad charm itself does not emit light. The light just now is a reflection from the deflection of the stunning charm. Of course, that's not the point. The point is that I'm going to show you next how I deal with trolls when facing such adversity." Professor Lockhart finished speaking, then pointed his wand at Hannah lying on the ground. Renervate, with a flash of red light, Hannah Abbott immediately opened her eyes, jolting awake from her unconsciousness. Amidst the gasps of her classmates, she stood up, dusted off her robes, and quickly moved aside. Too dangerous. She didn't even know when she had fallen asleep. Seeing that Hannah was in position, Professor Lockhart waved his wand again. Exio. Neville's desk was lifted as if by an invisible hand, whoosh, and flew to him, its wooden legs hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Class, I now ask you to be quiet. Next, is the moment to witness a classic." Lockhart drew out his words, slowly raising his wand. His fingertips trembled slightly, as if gathering magic. Almost all the young wizards held their breath at that moment. In an instant, he swung his wand down with the speed of an eagle's strike, the spell bursting forth with exaggerated force. Reduco. Professor Lockhart's spellcasting was always exaggerated and emotionally charged, a tactic the young wizards were already familiar with. But when they saw him use the shattering charm, they all gasped in unison, the classroom instantly falling silent enough to hear their own breathing. This spell was far more powerful than the stunning charm, as its name suggested. Once successfully cast, even the most sturdy obstacle could be instantly destroyed. Sherlock's eyes flickered at the sight. Lockhart in the books did indeed use this spell against trolls. However, teaching it in class seemed a bit beyond his comprehension. Neville's face turned deathly pale, his lips trembling slightly. He first stared wide-eyed in terror, then quickly closed them tightly, his long eyelashes quivering nervously. Perhaps in a moment of inspiration, as he closed his eyes, he shakily raised his wand and stammered, "Protect yourself." A faint blue light flashed from the tip of his wand, forming an invisible magical barrier in front of him. He had unexpectedly performed a superhuman feat, successfully casting the ironclad charm. Professor Lockhart's eyes widened in surprise at this sight. However, his hands didn't stop. A shattering charm, imbued with magical power, hurtled towards Neville. Chapter 187 No foreplay, let's get straight to the point. When Professor Lockhart's shattering spell reached Neville, the armor charm Neville had cast crumbled almost instantly. Compared to the magic of an adult wizard, the armor charm hastily concocted by a second-year student was utterly insignificant. Fortunately, the foreshadowing laid by the summoning charm took effect at that moment. A deafening roar resounded, as if the entire classroom trembled. The explosion filled the space, making the students' ears ring. Professor Lockhart's spell struck the desk in front of Neville squarely, the powerful magic instantly blasting it to smithereens, sending wood chips and dust flying like snowflakes. The classroom was filled with acrid smoke that lingered for a long time. As the smoke gradually cleared, everyone eagerly looked ahead. There stood Neville, covered in dust and wood chips, his hair disheveled and plastered to his face, a truly wretched sight. He himself was completely bewildered, his eyes filled with deep terror and confusion, as if he hadn't yet realized what had just happened. The desk that had been used to block the shattering charm was now nothing more than a pile of fine dust, quietly scattered on the floor. The entire class was stunned by this scene. Many stared at Neville with their mouths agape, their eyes filled with shock and lingering fear. The classroom was silent, you could almost hear a pin drop. Only then did Neville finally realize what had just happened. His legs went weak, and he collapsed to his knees on the podium with a thud, his wand slipping from his grasp and falling onto the platform. No one laughed at him. If that charm had actually hit Neville, he would now be just like the desk, scattered everywhere. See that? That's the shattering curse? Professor Lockhart's eyes gleamed with joy. I used this very move to severely injure the troll. Even with its enormous size, it still had to swallow the bitter pill of defeat when facing a wizard as skilled as me. With that, he turned around to the astonished gazes of the class, slightly raising his chin and bowing gracefully to everyone. His pale blue robes fluttered gently with the movement, making him appear exceptionally dashing. A round of applause, even more enthusiastic than before, erupted. The applause was devoid of technique, filled only with the students' heartfelt awe and admiration. I believe everyone now understands the power of the shattering curse. Imagine if that curse had struck Longbottom. Neville shuddered again upon hearing this. He hugged himself tightly, his eyes filled with fear. Professor Lockhart was very satisfied with Neville and the other students' performance. Of course, a troll's body is far sturdier than this desk. Even a dueling master like myself couldn't completely topple it with just a single shattering charm. To find out what happens next, please read my published works. Alright, that concludes today's lesson. Oh, right, I almost forgot something. With that, he elegantly waved his wand. The shattered planks and broken table legs seemed to be swiftly pieced together and repaired by an invisible hand, instantly restoring them to their previous perfect state. It was as if the previous breakage had been an illusion. His gesture immediately drew even more enthusiastic applause from the classroom. Especially the little witches, their eyes sparkling, their gazes filled with adoration and admiration. Undoubtedly, Professor Lockhart, who had initially been underestimated, had successfully proven his abilities through one brilliant practical teaching session after another. When the crisp sound of the dismissal bell rang, a beaming Professor Lockhart, like a triumphant hero, left the classroom smugly, surrounded by a throng of little witches. The others quickly surrounded Neville. Neville stood in the middle of the group, scratching his head somewhat awkwardly. The young wizards began bombarding him with questions about his feelings. Neville blushed and stammered out his honest answer. At crucial points, he gestured wildly, drawing gasps of amazement from the others. Ron stood to the side, his brow furrowed, his expression grim. I don't understand. The intense emotional turmoil even altered his accent. His voice held a hint of doubt and dissatisfaction. I admit, Professor Lockhart is indeed amazing, but why does he always have to act as the clown for most of the class? Can't he just skip the preamble and get straight to the point? To be honest, I don't understand either, Seamus agreed. If he could remove all this useless stuff, he could compete for the title of Hogwarts best professor. I think it's fine this way. Parvati Petty crossed her arms, straightened her back, and vehemently opposed Seamus's opinion. Professor Lockhart is clearly doing this out of good intentions, trying to make us more immersed. Have you forgotten what he said? Only by immersing yourself in the role you're playing can you have a better experience. If you don't believe me, just look at Longbottom. Hey, Even without this method, I think it's enough. HMPH, I wonder how many people dream of acting with Professor Lockhart. You should be content. I don't think acting with him is anything to be proud of. Only you little girls think that way. Who are you calling a little girl? Don't forget, the top student in the grade is a girl too. Seamus and Pettier argued back and forth, each sticking to their own opinion. Some classmates sided with Seamus, nodding in agreement, while others supported Pettier, cheering her on. Then there were those like Ron, eager to stir things up. Good job, Seamus. You've had close contact with house elves. Cheer up, Petty. Your twin sister is highly trusted by Professor Lockhart in Ravenclaw. You mustn't embarrass her. Watching this scene, Harry shook his head and turned to Sherlock. Sherlock, what do you think? For him, things weren't so complicated. When in doubt, he'd just ask Sherlock. Sherlock, as always, carefully observed Professor Lockhart's entire teaching process, even including the previously considered boring stage play. When Harry asked, he quickly replied while tidying his stationery. Lockhart spends about 2/3 to 3/4 of each class performing, and the rest of the time is actually spent teaching. Judging from both his time allocation and his actual performance in class, he's clearly more enthusiastic about the former. As for the practical content that everyone's interested in, it's more like a task to be completed for him, but that's what we really need. Harry voiced the young wizard's concerns. If Lockhart didn't teach them some practical material at the end of each class, they would never be cooperating with him in this silly self-promotional stage play. Of course, some young witches, due to their idol-like bias, think Lockhart shines in everything he does. Hermione deserves special mention here. She's now one of the girls who crowds around Professor Lockhart after every class. My dear Harry, you've found a blind spot again. Sherlock smiled slightly. There's no doubt that our defense against the dark arts professor is truly skilled. However, more than the teaching itself, he cares about his glamorous public image and the hidden benefits. Harry was slightly taken aback. Benefits? Remember those textbooks that were instantly torn to shreds in the first class? I already mentioned it to you then. Professor Lockhart seemed unusually pleased the moment those textbooks were ripped apart. Although that expression was fleeting, I still quote it. Sherlock mimicked Lockhart's expression at the time, a smug look on his face. I remember. Harry nodded repeatedly. I found it strange at the time. It really didn't make sense. What teacher would be happy to tear up a student's textbook? From the perspective of an ordinary teacher, of course it doesn't make sense. Sherlock looked at Harry, intentionally guiding his friend. But what if you see him as a businessman with a head full of business acumen? Sherlock, you mean? Harry's face showed a thoughtful expression, followed by a look of shock and understanding in his eyes. For students, textbooks are essential for learning magic. If a textbook is torn up, students have to buy a new one. Every book sold is a considerable income for this professor and author. Sherlock paused, a complex look in his eyes. As far as I know, after the first class, Professor Lockhart couldn't wait to find those poor souls whose textbooks had been torn up. What for? How? He offered to sell them his entire series of works at a 30% discount. Harry's eyes widened in surprise again. What? What is this all about? Ah, I get it. You understand. Yes. This way, not only will everyone not feel that buying books is a burden, but they'll even thank Professor Lockhart. Bingo. That's exactly what I deduced, Harry. You've been with me for so long that you're starting to analyze things using deductive reasoning. So the conclusion is that Professor Lockhart isn't interested in the course itself, he's just going through the motions of teaching us. For him, the real purpose was to gain fame and fortune so that his career could reach new heights. Hearing Sherlock's words, Harry suddenly understood. So, Professor Lockhart was that kind of person? Sherlock glanced at Harry twice, then said nothing more. Actually, he had discovered some other things. However, due to insufficient evidence at the moment, he didn't intend to reveal these speculations. Next, it was time to find the evidence. Chapter 188. I don't even have the thing. The Ravenclaw headmaster's office. Professor Felix Flitwick was engrossed in a mountain of parchment work. A warm, dim light streamed from the magical chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Ancient magical books filled the surrounding shelves, some occasionally humming softly as if conversing. Just as he was feeling a bit tired and wondering if he could get some potions from Professor Snape to refresh himself, a sharp knock broke the silence. Come in. Professor Flitwick didn't look up, simply waving his wand. With a soft creak, the door slowly opened automatically. Only then did he look up. He paused slightly when he saw who it was, then quickly beckoned. "It's you? Come in quickly. Is there some case going on?" Sherlock Holmes, dressed in a sharp wizard's robe, the collar slightly open, had slightly disheveled hair, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. With Professor Flitwick's permission, Sherlock entered the office, his gaze quickly sweeping over his surroundings. This wasn't his first time in the Ravenclaw Dean's office. It was no different from before. Professor Flitwick wasn't surprised at all that Sherlock was here. With Sherlock's abilities, answering the Ravenclaw door knocker question would be a piece of cake. Seeing Sherlock enter the room, he immediately jumped down from his tall, ornate chair. Ironically, this jump made him even shorter than when he was sitting. Realizing he had to look up to see Sherlock, Professor Flitwick, without a word, jumped back into the chair. The whole thing took less than 3 seconds. After completing this action, Professor Flitwick coughed and pointed to the person opposite him. "Sit down first." Once Sherlock sat down and found himself at eye level with Professor Flitwick, Professor Flitwick nodded in satisfaction. Sherlock, unfazed by Professor Flitwick's obsession with height, cut to the chase. "Professor, I'm not here for the case. I heard Professor Lockhart graduated from Ravenclaw, so I'd like to ask you some questions about him." Gideon Lockhart. Upon hearing the name, Flitwick raised an eyebrow. Why the sudden urge to ask about him? Because of his performance in the defense against the dark arts class, Sherlock recounted Professor Lockhart's recent activities, stating his assumption directly. "He's not here for teaching." "You think so?" Professor Flitwick feigned surprise, then nodded gently. "I understand. So, what do you want to know about him?" "Everything you know about him." Hearing Sherlock's somewhat unusual answer, Professor Flitwick chuckled. "You child? Well, I'll tell you." He looked at Sherlock with doting eyes, increasingly feeling that Sherlock's absence from Ravenclaw was a significant loss. Intelligent, quick-witted, and with a strong thirst for knowledge, what a promising talent. Unfortunately, what's done is done, and it's too late to say anything now. However, even though Sherlock is a Gryffindor, he's still willing to offer as much assistance as possible within his duties. So, after agreeing to Sherlock's request, Professor Flitwick fell silent, lost in memories of the past. Sherlock didn't disturb him, simply watching him quietly. During his school days, Lockhart was an exceptionally bright child. After a moment, Professor Flitwick finally spoke, his voice low and tinged with emotion. "Lockhart is a half-blood wizard, his father is a muggle, his mother a witch, and he has 2 older sisters. It must be said that Lockhart was exceptionally gifted. He inherited not only his father's handsome appearance but also his mother's magical talent. In contrast, his 2 sisters were both muggles. Because of this, Lockhart's mother doted on him immensely. Under such unreserved pampering, Lockhart inevitably became somewhat arrogant." Sherlock nodded. The influence of family environment on a child is truly immense. A prime example is Harry's cousin Dudley. He was spoiled rotten by the Dursleys. But there are exceptions. Harry, for instance. It's a miracle that Harry, growing up in such an environment, developed such a pure and kind character and didn't become a vengeful scoundrel. The year Lockhart received his Hogwarts acceptance letter, I had just become the head of Ravenclaw. Professor Flitwick suddenly chuckled. "Sherlock, do you know? Lockhart almost became a hat trap back then." "A hat trap?" Sherlock reacted quickly, immediately deducing what had happened from Professor Flitwick's words. "So, he almost got sorted into another house. Let me think. Slytherin, right, you're always so perceptive." Professor Flitwick gave her an approving look, confirming Sherlock's deduction as she continued. "After Lockhart entered Ravenclaw, he thought he would be the center of attention like he was in the Muggle world, but reality disappointed him somewhat. He and his mother forgot one thing: Hogwarts gathers wizarding talents from all over Britain and Ireland, so he wasn't the most eye-catching one. However, from my observation, while his magical talent isn't as outstanding as yours or Miss Granger's, it still surpasses most of his classmates. Even without much effort, he can achieve good grades just by using his brain. But his biggest flaw is that he's too ambitious. He has to be the best at everything, otherwise he's unwilling to try. All the teachers, including myself, know that if he were willing to work hard, he would definitely achieve something in the future, though not as exaggerated as he boasts." At this point, Professor Flitwick sighed softly, a hint of regret on his face, as if he felt sorry for Lockhart. "How did he boast about it? You're actually interested in that?" Professor Flitwick glanced at Sherlock with some surprise. Dear Professor Flitwick, as I just said, you need to know everything about him. Well, he often brags to his classmates that he can create the Philosopher's Stone before graduation. He'll lead the England Quidditch team to victory in the World Cup. He also says he'll become the youngest Minister for Magic in Britain after graduation. Sherlock, seeing Sherlock's expression, Professor Flitwick couldn't help but chuckle. Actually, I really think the Sorting Hat should have sorted Lockhart into Slytherin, because he studies purely to get attention, and he's extremely eager for awards. To show off, he went to the headmaster to ask him to start a school newspaper, hoping that his name could be printed in it and appear in front of everyone. Unfortunately, Dumbledore didn't grant his wish, so he started doing even more outrageous things. He used magic to carve his name into a 20-foot-long letter on the Quidditch pitch, and as a result, he was put in solitary confinement for a week. Later, he threw his portrait into the sky like a dark mark, and unsurprisingly, he was penalized again and put in solitary confinement. Even more outrageous, he sent himself 800 Valentine's Day cards, leaving the entire dining hall covered in owl droppings and feathers, making it impossible for anyone to eat breakfast. Professor Flitwick went on to recount some other anecdotes about Lockhart during his student days. After listening to Professor Flitwick's account, Sherlock understood why the professors had reacted that way when they saw Lockhart at the start of the semester. Where there's smoke, there's fire. At this point, Professor Flitwick's smile faded, replaced by a look of doubt, but what's most perplexing is the method he used to obtain his positions. In 5th year, nobody knew what he did, but he somehow managed to get the prefect to willingly come to me and offer to relinquish his position. You should know very well that the prefect position is extremely important at Hogwarts. It requires not only excellent grades but also outstanding leadership skills and character. Normally, it's a highly competitive process with multiple rounds of selection, yet he did it so easily. In 7th year, he used the same method, getting the student council president to hand over his position as well. These two incidents caused quite a stir at the school. Everyone was speculating about his methods, but no one had a definitive answer. To be honest, I even wondered if he had velar blood. Professor Flitwick frowned, his doubt deepening. How? This time, Sherlock smiled without saying a word. He could do the same things if he wanted to. He simply disdained to do it. For all these reasons, we all breathed a sigh of relief when he graduated from Hogwarts. Later, he became a minor celebrity writer, traveling the world and frequently visiting exotic places. It was during this process that his fame grew, eventually making him a superstar in the wizarding world, even earning him the Order of Merlin, 3rd class. Professor Flitwick paused here, then said heavily, "You know, I don't even have that, Sherlock." From Professor Flitwick's words, he sensed a deep resentment. With just a slight shift in perspective, Sherlock understood the source of Professor Flitwick's resentment. His former student had become his colleague, possessing an honor he himself lacked. The key point was that he hadn't even thought highly of him back then. It was a case of the heavens turning against him. Chapter 189 The Crazy Girl. After Quirrell's incident, the defense against the dark arts position became vacant again this year, and Dumbledore approached him. Although he has indeed achieved a great deal, everyone, including myself, remembers his performance as a student, so we were all puzzled by Dumbledore's decision. At the time, I thought they simply couldn't find anyone else for the course, so they chose him. But now it seems that perhaps I was wrong about him back then. I think your opinion is correct. Although he is fame-seeking, vain, and even had impure motives for becoming a professor at Hogwarts, he is still a qualified defense against the dark arts professor. With that, Professor Flitwick finished explaining his opinion of Lockhart. As Sherlock had expected, as the head of Ravenclaw, he knew far more than anyone else. Sherlock clasped his hands together, resting his chin on them, and fell silent. Sherlock, as long as he can teach his students real skills, shouldn't we stop trying to uncover his secrets? After all, everyone at Hogwarts has their own secrets, doesn't they? As he said this, Professor Flitwick seemed lost in thought, a faint melancholy appearing in his eyes. Sherlock didn't notice. After a moment, he lowered his hands and stood up. "Are you leaving already?" Seeing his movement, Professor Flitwick was somewhat surprised. "Yes, Professor, your description was very clear and helpful." "Thank you." Watching Sherlock politely thank him and leave, Professor Flitwick was first taken aback, then chuckled. "That little fellow, really?" He shook his head and buried himself back in the mountain of parchment assignments. Leaving Professor Flitwick's office, Sherlock carefully reviewed the information Professor Flitwick had provided. possessing above-average magical talent, a strong desire for recognition, a calculating nature, good grades during his time at Hogwarts, but frequently causing controversy. After graduating, he traveled the world, suddenly had an epiphany, and ultimately made a triumphant return. No wonder he was almost sorted into Slytherin. Sherlock smiled. This trait of Lockhart really did fit the Slytherin mold perfectly. Now, Professor Flitwick admitted he had misjudged him and even advised Sherlock not to continue digging into Lockhart's secrets. Sherlock didn't object to this. These things were judged by actions, not intentions. As long as he could teach everyone real skills, even if his motives weren't pure, it wouldn't be a big problem. As for the contradictions he sensed in him, Professor Flitwick's description made them seem reasonable. It was simply a struggle between ideals and reality. However, even after learning everything about Lockhart from Professor Flitwick, there were still many suspicious points about him. The biggest suspicious point was that, as a professor, Lockhart's mastery of magic had changed. Only he noticed that Lockhart's spell proficiency had increased significantly compared to the Lockhart in the first lesson. By now, almost everyone believed Lockhart had deliberately gone easy on the first lesson. However, Sherlock saw it clearly. The panic on Lockhart's face when the house elf first appeared wasn't feigned. More importantly, he consistently resisted using truly effective spells. Instead, he seemed more drawn to his self-created pissed spells, even if they were ineffective. In every defense against the dark arts class, Lockhart felt aversion and resistance when using practical spells. A feeling that lessened or disappeared only after a successful cast. However, everyone's attention was focused on the spell's effects, and no one noticed this. Sherlock walked along, lost in thought, and when he came to his senses, he was astonished to find himself outside Hogwarts Castle. Not only outside the castle, but already at the school gates. Even more miraculously, he hadn't been discovered by anyone. Sherlock immediately realized that even in his dazed state, he had instinctively used his stealth skills, successfully avoiding most people's sight. This had become instinctive for him. But since he'd already arrived at the school gate, Sherlock simply walked out. This was the place they'd come from by carriage at the start of the semester. He vividly remembered that only he could see the creature pulling the carriage back then. As he pondered this, he suddenly noticed another carriage parked at the school gate. The magical creature, invisible to everyone else, was still harnessed to the carriage and its shafts. Besides it, there was a person standing there. A somewhat strange-looking girl. From Sherlock's perspective, he could only see her back. She had dark golden brown hair and wore a pair of carrot-shaped earrings. With Sherlock's extraordinary observational skills, he also noticed that she wore a strangely shaped necklace, and her wand was tucked behind her left ear. Even just her back view exuded an air of strangeness. However, for Sherlock, this wasn't the point. The point was that the girl was gently stroking the magical creature's back. Undoubtedly, she, like him, could also see this creature that others couldn't. By now, Sherlock had already researched this magical creature. Thestrals. Their origin is unknown, but they still exist in the Forbidden Forest of Hogwarts. These creatures are essentially a type of winged horse, with a dragon's head, a horse's body, and bat-like black wings. Their eyes are silver-white with no pupils, and their massive black bodies have no flesh, therefore clinging tightly to their bones. On the first day of school, due to the heavy rain and his eagerness to attend the ceremony, Sherlock hadn't had a chance to observe them closely. Today, however, he noticed their bones were clearly visible, with a long black tail trailing behind, and wings growing from the ridges between the bones. "You can see them too, right?" Just then, the girl suddenly spoke. This was the second time the girl had surprised Sherlock. He was very confident in his stealth abilities. The fact that he hadn't been discovered along the way was ample proof of that. He hadn't expected that in less than a minute, this girl would have discovered him. Keep in mind, this girl hadn't turned around yet. That is to say, she had noticed someone approaching while her back was to him. Coupled with her special ability to see the Thestrals, Sherlock immediately became interested in her. Before Sherlock could answer, the girl turned around. Aside from the dark golden brown hair he'd seen from behind, the girl had pale skin and light eyebrows. Her silver eyes bulged slightly, and although they were looking at him, they seemed large but lifeless. Besides the carrot-shaped earrings, Sherlock now clearly saw the necklace around her neck. It was made of beer bottle corks. Upon seeing her clearly, Sherlock's eyes lit up. He found the corresponding information in his memory attic. This girl, he had seen her before. At the same time, the girl's lifeless eyes seemed to finally recognize Sherlock. "You're Sherlock Holmes, I know you." Although she called him by name immediately, Sherlock wasn't surprised. Instead, he slowly said, "I know you too, a first-year student, assigned to Ravenclaw. Born into a wizarding family, your mother died early, raised by your father, an only child, loves reading, your name." Sherlock tilted his head, thought for a moment, and then simply said, "I forgot." Hearing Sherlock's words, the girl's eyes bulged even more, looking extremely surprised. "You don't even know my name, how do you know all this?" Then, before Sherlock could answer, the girl laughed again, saying in a singing voice, "How silly of me, you're Sherlock Holmes, it's perfectly normal for you to know these things." That was true. Sherlock noticed a distinctly eccentric quality about this girl. "So, what's your name, Luna Lovegood?" She stared intently at Sherlock. "You can call me Luna, and I can call you Sherlock, okay?" Faced with this seemingly presumptuous reason, Sherlock calmly replied, "As you wish. I've always felt that exceptional intelligence is humanity's greatest asset." "Sherlock, don't you agree? Intelligence is indeed a valuable asset, but it's not humanity's only asset. Courage, kindness, and loyalty are equally important. Often, they determine a person's worth more than intelligence." Luna tilted her head, listening attentively to Sherlock's answer. Despite it being their first meeting, their conversation flowed as smoothly as that of old friends. At the same time, both Sherlock and Luna considered this perfectly natural, showing no surprise whatsoever. The rapid-fire conversation continued. You know me, because you've heard about me from others, Penelope, Cho Chang, or Pettier, Prefect Penelope, and Ginny Weasley. How, that's unexpected. Oh, how should I put it? I guess they think I'm a bit odd. Actually, some people call me Crazy Girl Lovegood. But Ginny stopped them from calling me that, so we became good friends, and I don't think they were wrong. Coincidentally, I don't consider myself a normal person either, but that's not important. How did you find out about me just now? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 190 Luna Lovegood. Outside the gates of Hogwarts. Sherlock and Luna looked at each other. "That's because you were bothered by gnats." When Sherlock asked how she'd found him, Luna looked at him with pity. "When you came over, I felt several buzzing around here." "Gnats?" Sherlock raised an eyebrow. "Gnats, they're invisible. They float into your ears and mess with your brain," Luna said, slapping the air with her hands as if shooing away unseen moths. Sherlock stared at Luna, making sure she wasn't joking, and chuckled softly. Interesting, he had already thoroughly studied the book Fantastic Beasts and Their Origins. He spent 3 seconds searching his memory attic, but found no record of the creature Luna called a gnat. He then searched through other materials he'd found in the library over the past 2 school years, but still couldn't find this strange creature. Luna didn't ask Sherlock why he found it interesting, she simply reached out and gently stroked the Thestral's body again. As she stroked it, she suddenly said, "You've seen death too, obviously. Many people say it's an unlucky animal, bringing all sorts of terrible calamities to those who see it. What do you think?" After saying this, Luna stared intently at Sherlock. Anyone else might have found Luna's gaze somewhat eerie. However, Sherlock remained calm. "Evidence, what did you say?" Seemingly surprised by Sherlock's answer, Luna tilted her head. "I said, evidence. Any claim needs strong supporting evidence to stand." Sherlock looked at the Thestral behind Luna and spoke quickly. "To date, there is no evidence that this creature brings misfortune to people. I only consider claims without evidence as rumors. On the contrary, according to Fantastic Beasts and the places in the Hogwarts library records, Thestrals are very intelligent and useful. Once tamed, they will never leave their masters. Not only that, Thestrals have an amazing sense of direction. Just tell them where you want to go, and they will take you there. In addition, they fly very fast, so in my opinion, such creatures can completely replace flying brooms as a means of transportation. Because they can greatly save wizards' energy. What I'm more curious about now is how Hogwarts tamed these magical creatures and made them work for them." Sherlock walked up to the Thestral as he spoke. He stood side by side with Luna and then placed his hand on the Thestral. The Thestral felt just like a horse to Sherlock, which didn't surprise him. What was strange, however, was the Thestral's behavior. When it saw that both Sherlock and Luna could see it and placed their hands on it, it shrank its neck. "It's scared," Luna said confidently, observing the Thestral's behavior. "Because it's used to being ignored by others, and suddenly the two of us can see it, it's getting scared." Watching Sherlock withdraw his hands, Luna tilted her head again, staring at Sherlock with curiosity. "What else do you want to ask?" "Go ahead, you seem to say something different from what Ginny said." Luna paused. "I mean, she said that although you're her brother's good friend, you're actually a strange person." "I already said, I'm definitely not a normal person." "Really? But I think you're quite normal." "Thank you, I'll take that as a compliment. By the way, what has death looked like to you? Can you tell me?" Luna asked curiously. "People say, only those who have seen death can see Thestrals. But I know people who have seen death and still can't see them." "That's because that's not accurate enough." "Then what's the accurate way to say it?" "Only those who have directly seen death and understand its meaning can see it. Merely seeing death doesn't mean you can see them." "Of course, it's precisely because only those who have seen death can see Thestrals that they are considered an unlucky symbol." "I see." After hearing Sherlock's first sentence, Luna didn't pay attention to what followed. She was lost in deep thought. Only today did she understand something. When she was 9, her mother died in an accident during a spell experiment, and she was raised by her father alone ever since. So, even back then, I already understood the meaning of death. When she came to her senses, she was about to ask Sherlock a few more questions when she found herself in front of empty space. Sherlock had vanished without a trace. Seeing her newly met friend leave without a word, Luna wasn't surprised at all. She approached the Thestral again and gently patted its shiny neck. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes is not only an eccentric, but also a very interesting person." Sherlock left because he understood what had happened when he saw Luna lost in thought. After all, he himself often fell into this state. So he knew that this state often lasted for a long time. He had already waited long enough outside the school gates, so he simply returned to Hogwarts Castle. As for Luna Lovegood, let her continue to ponder. Sherlock was busy. Harry wasn't idle either. Because the man finally appeared. Oliver Wood, captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, an average-sized burly man, a Quidditch fanatic. Since the start of the school year, Harry had been going to practice with Sherlock every morning. But one Saturday morning, this burly man showed up before Sherlock and Harry even left their dormitory, shaking Harry awake. "Sherlock, why are you up so early today?" "Oliver." The moment Harry saw Wood, he snapped awake. What was going on? Had the competition between the teams become this fierce this year? Even the Quidditch team captain was learning boxing from Sherlock. However, Harry had clearly misjudged the situation. Wood's early arrival had nothing to do with Sherlock. He was simply there to get Harry to Quidditch practice. According to the captain, getting up early was part of their new training plan this year. Because other teams hadn't even started their training yet, they wanted to be the first. Despite yawning constantly, Harry obediently got out of bed. Kind-hearted as he was, he always felt responsible for the team's loss in the final match last year. He had always wanted to do something to make amends, and now that he had this opportunity, he naturally wanted to work hard. "Holmes, are you really not going to join?" While Harry was looking for his uniform, Wood looked at Sherlock again, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "With your flying skills, if you could join our house team, our entire frontline defense would be practically flawless." Before Sherlock could answer, Ron, who had been woken up, rubbed his eyes and subconsciously interrupted. "Hey, Weasley, how did you know what I was going to say?" Wood was quite surprised that Ron could say what he wanted to say. "Please, my dear Captain, you've said that to Sherlock countless times," Ron complained. "It's barely dawn. Even if we're going to train, it doesn't have to be this intense." Since the start of the semester, he had actually gone to morning training with Sherlock and Harry once. It was yesterday morning. However, after just that one time, he decided to give up. Getting up early for morning training was just so boring. So last night he told Harry not to call him anymore. He was giving up, lying down, not going. Today was Saturday, and he thought he could sleep in, but the Quidditch captain showed up again. He was utterly speechless. "Weasley, I remember you wanted to join the Quidditch team last year." "That's right, but if you still have that plan this year, you should give up on it as soon as possible. I really don't know how you can sleep at such a young age. The worse our training conditions are, the less likely we are to make mistakes in the actual matches. By the way, Mr. Holmes, are you really not planning to join the team? After receiving a negative answer, a regretful Wood pulled Harry, who was wearing the bright red team uniform, away hastily. Good heavens, I do love Quidditch, but Wood, Ron couldn't help but complain to Sherlock as soon as Wood left. I really don't know what to say about him. Having a hobby and being able to dedicate yourself to it is actually a lot of fun. Hearing Sherlock's comment, Ron murmured, I guess only you would think that way. Without Harry, Ron had already decided to slack off again, so Sherlock went to his morning training alone. Solo training naturally required real equipment, so the wooden stick he originally used to teach Harry fencing was left in the dormitory. When he returned to the dormitory, he saw Ron and Neville playing with a long stick that he and Harry usually used for practice. Sherlock, you're back, Ron shouted excitedly as soon as he saw Sherlock. Where did you find such a straight and long stick? We don't have any sticks like that in our garden. Thanks to Reader 20171008181529432 for the 100 Kidian coins. Your support is my motivation to update. Chapter 191 Hermione Granger vs. Gemma Farry. Holmes, I'm so sorry, Weasley just took out these two sticks, and I couldn't help myself. Even though he was already a sophomore, Neville still hadn't changed his shy introverted personality. Of course, it was precisely for this reason that he became one of Professor Lockhart's favorite students. They're everywhere by the lake. Sherlock glanced at the two and casually commented, wrong grip. Hey, we're just playing around. Why are you taking it so seriously? Ron said. Neville's eyes lit up. Mr. Holmes, what's the correct way to hold a stick? Not a stick, a sword, Sherlock said, taking the stick from Ron and casually demonstrating a standard sword-holding posture. This was something he had already taught Harry when he first started teaching him fencing. Neville memorized this scene. After a short stay in the dormitory, Sherlock and Ron went to the Great Hall for breakfast. Hermione, who arrived earlier, was surprised to see only the two of them and asked, "Where's Harry?" Usually, Sherlock and Harry would have just arrived after their morning exercises. Today, Sherlock was not only faster, but he had also lost Harry. Wood dragged him to Quidditch practice, Ron mumbled, his mouth still full of food. He woke me up too. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, Hermione said irritably, then looked at Sherlock and invited him, "Shall we go to the library later?" Although it was an invitation, it was already their usual routine. Since last semester, the two of them had spent every weekend at the library. If nothing unexpected happened, this week would be no different. However, this time, before she could even finish speaking and Sherlock could reply, a voice abruptly cut in between them. "Sherlock, may I speak with you?" With that mature yet slightly languid voice, a beautiful figure appeared at the Gryffindor dining table. Tall, with chestnut hair and a delicate face, Gemma Farley was a sixth-year Slytherin student and also the female prefect of Slytherin. Hermione immediately became alert upon seeing her. "Prefect Farley, what are you doing here? Didn't I already say?" Farley smiled slightly at Hermione, then looked at Sherlock. "I have something I'd like to discuss with Sherlock alone." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "What can't be said here? Why do you need to talk to me alone?" Farley maintained her elegant smile, but her words caused Hermione to frown. "Miss Granger, I invited Sherlock. This seems to have nothing to do with you. I am Sherlock's friend." Hermione, though shorter than Farley, was no less imposing, her gaze fixed on Farley. "As a friend, it is my responsibility to help Sherlock guard against those with ulterior motives." "Miss Granger, who are you calling with ulterior motives?" "Whoever responds, I'll name them. If you're talking about me, that's rather petty. Given the actions of your students, I can't help but be petty." Recently, the rivalry between Gryffindor and Slytherin has intensified. Every time Gryffindor gains a lead in other subjects, Slytherin uses their home advantage in potions to tie the score. Professor Snape, while constantly awarding Slytherin students extra points, also deducts points from Gryffindor. Under such circumstances, Hermione naturally wouldn't give this prefect a friendly look. Looking at the imposing Hermione, Gemma Farley couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. This year's Gryffindor class is full of talent. Having the Lion King and the Savior was already enough to make them happy, but they hadn't expected there to be another expert here. Last year, she thought this know-it-all girl was just a bookworm, but now it seemed that wasn't the case. Thinking of this, She decided to temporarily abandon her confrontation with Hermione and turn her attention back to the main character, looking into Sherlock's gray eyes and asking, "Sherlock, are you coming?" Sherlock nodded and stood up immediately. "Let's go." Seeing Sherlock agree, Hermione panicked. "Sherlock, my dear Hermione, don't worry," Sherlock said calmly, and left with Farley amidst Hermione's surprised and helpless gaze. After they left, Hermione turned around and glared at Ron, who was still eating his melon. "All you do is eat. Why didn't you say anything?" "Say something." Ron swallowed the melon in his mouth. "Why should I say anything? She's a Slytherin prefect. Have you forgotten what happened at the end of last term? If she has bad intentions, Hermione, I think you're being too sensitive. If Miss Farley really had bad intentions, how could Sherlock not see it?" "That's hard to say," Hermione snorted and said irritably. "Don't worry," Ron chuckled. "If Miss Farley really wanted to harm Sherlock, I think she's the one who should be worried. Besides, I don't think Miss Farley is that kind of person. You've forgotten, even Percy and Ravenclaw's Clear Springs prefect said she's different from the other Slytherins." Hearing Ron say this, Hermione felt a little relieved. "That's for the best, but there's something really strange." "What is it? Didn't you notice just now that Miss Farley called Sherlock Sherlock? I clearly remember she called Sherlock Holmes last term." Hermione suddenly looked up. Her relationship with Sherlock had progressed so rapidly, hadn't it all started with calling each other by name? She was used to calling Sherlock by name, so when she heard Farley call Sherlock by his first name, she hadn't noticed anything amiss. But Ron had noticed. This wasn't a good sign. Sherlock followed Gemma Farley up the stairs. The wooden staircase creaked softly beneath their feet, echoing through the empty corridor. They walked up to the 4th floor, and when they reached an empty classroom, Gemma gently pushed open the old wooden door, the hinges creaking slightly. She gestured for Sherlock to enter, then closed the door. The door slammed shut with a dull thud, as if shutting out all the noise of the outside world. "This classroom is usually deserted," Gemma said, walking straight to the center of the classroom and stopping at a table. She gently waved her wand, a faint blue light flashing at its tip, and a wisp of silver mist appeared, swirling around 2 glasses of orange juice. "I think you'll like them." Wisps of steam rose from the glasses, creating a hazy mist in the air. Sherlock noticed a mint leaf clinging to the rim of one of the glasses, clearly a mark of the house elf's obsessive-compulsive tendencies. "Your friend," Gemma said slowly, tapping the rim of her glass with her meticulously manicured nails, "seems to have imagined me as a chimera." A chimera is a magical creature native to Greece, known for its bloodthirstiness and violence. It has the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a dragon. The British Ministry of Magic classifies most magical creatures into danger levels, and the chimera is at the highest level. Gemma deliberately mimicked Hermione's tense expression from earlier, her sky-blue eyes revealing a hint of mischief, clearly expressing her displeasure. "It's not just an imagined danger," Sherlock said, walking to the table and sitting down unhurriedly. He leaned back, casually resting his hands on the armrests of his chair. "It's not just Hermione. Most Gryffindor students would find it hard to like you. But I don't recall the Slytherin prefect's job being to dispense calming potions to every paranoid Gryffindor." Gemma frowned slightly, a hint of helplessness flashing in her eyes. "Sherlock, you don't need to be so aggressive when you talk to me. I think you should know that even as a prefect, I can't control every Slytherin student. Why would I need to control them?" "What? If Slytherin students need a prefect's control to live a normal life, I think they should leave as soon as possible. Hogwarts isn't suitable for them." Gemma's eyes lit up, and she looked at Sherlock with admiration, her eyes full of approval. "Sherlock, I'm increasingly convinced you should come to Slytherin." She leaned forward slightly, placing her hands on the table, a gesture that revealed her shapely figure beneath her loose robes. Resourceful, strong-willed, and with a certain disdain for rules, these qualities are so fitting for Slytherin. Sherlock seemed oblivious to this, a polite smile playing on his lips, but one tinged with a barely perceptible aloofness. "Excuse me, Prefect, as far as I know, there are currently no Muggle-born wizards in Slytherin." Gemma keenly noticed this, responding with a slight pout and a hint of reproach. "Didn't we tell each other during summer vacation not to call me that anymore? And at first night of school, I didn't even have a chance to correct you." "All right, Miss Gemma, so which Slytherin student did you call me here for today? As a prefect, you really go to great lengths for them." Gemma glared at Sherlock. "Couldn't it be to see you?" Her voice was as gentle as a spring breeze. Sherlock's tone was calm. "No." Gemma was slightly taken aback, Why? Chapter 192 Traveling with a Female Class Monitor. If you wanted to find me, you would have written to me by owl, or you would have said so in the Great Hall, instead of coming here. Hearing Gemma ask why, Sherlock answered without hesitation. Well, I knew it, Gemma sighed, then gave Sherlock a long, meaningful look. I came to find you because of Draco Malfoy, she added silently to herself, but it wasn't just about that guy, Miss Gemma. I think you know very well that his relationship with Harry is far worse than Marcus Flint's. Of course I know, Gemma smiled slightly, her finger tracing the rim of her glass. But compared to Flint, at least he didn't really harm Mr. Potter. Quite the opposite, he's the one who gets hurt every time. Last year, before school started, Crabbe and Goyle were beaten up by Sherlock on the train. Malfoy escaped unscathed, but he was still quite shaken. He then devised a plan to trick Harry and Ron into a midnight duel, but Sherlock saw through his scheme and he was ridiculed by the entire school, unable to hold his head high for over a month. Later, during a Quidditch match, Malfoy, assuming Sherlock wasn't there, launched a tirade against Gryffindor. However, Sherlock suddenly appeared and led the Slytherins to a brutal beating of the snake. Malfoy was the first to suffer, and after being knocked down, he spent 2 or 3 days resting in the school hospital. Since then, Malfoy has learned his lesson, only daring to provoke with words. So when Gemma mentioned this, Sherlock laughed. Okay, I admit you're right. Seeing that Sherlock was no longer avoiding topics related to Malfoy, Gemma quickly added, Draco Malfoy's father bought each member of the Slytherin Quidditch team a Nimbus 2001. A Nimbus 2001. Sherlock immediately remembered the shopkeeper who had sold him and Hermione flying broomsticks in Diagon Alley. Gemma, thinking he didn't know, patiently explained, yes, it's the same series as your friend Mr. Potter's Nimbus 2000. It's the latest model, released this August, and it's even faster than the previous Nimbus 2000, Sherlock replied without hesitation. So old Malfoy wants his son to join the Quidditch team. Exactly. From what I've observed, Malfoy's performance in flying lessons isn't bad, even by his true ability. He's good enough to join the team. Just like last year, the Quidditch team is recruiting again. Since second-year students can directly join the team as official members, Malfoy could easily join through the normal channels. That's the problem, Gemma frowned. If Draco could join the house team through the formal selections like Potter, there wouldn't be any problem. But joining the house team this way, even if he's truly capable, will inevitably lead to gossip, with people thinking he paid his way in. Sherlock chuckled and retorted, isn't that true, huh, Draco Malfoy? He did indeed pay his way into the house team, but you just said his flying skills are good enough for the house team. These two things aren't contradictory, Miss Gemma. Sherlock looked at the prefect who was so concerned about Slytherin. During the summer, she had provided him with numerous cases of crime in the magical world. More importantly, unlike other Slytherins, she had consistently shown him goodwill. Sherlock decided to give her a good talking to. Miss Gemma, regardless of Malfoy's true ability, it became irrelevant the moment his father bought flying broomsticks for the Slytherin team. Hearing this, Gemma's eyes narrowed sharply. Sherlock, you might as well be more explicit, Sherlock chuckled, tapping the table lightly with his knuckles. Miss Gemma, since you've come to me for advice, let's use 3 logical anchors to untangle your thoughts. First, Malfoy's flying talent is as real as the roots of a mandrake. You and I both know that. Second, old Malfoy's galleons are like poisonous tentacles entwined around the broom handle. Even Mrs. Norris can smell the stench of money. Third, when money and talent shine simultaneously, the public will always only focus on the more dazzling light. At this point, Sherlock grabbed the orange juice on the table, pointing to the droplets sliding down the glass. See this condensation? No matter how you wipe it, people will assume it's the Malfoy family's vault frosting over. So my advice is, instead of getting hung up on the moral shards on the broom, focus your energy on the training field. Most people in this world only care about results, and wizards are no exception. When Slytherin actually lifts the Quidditch Cup, everyone will shut up. Seeing Gemma's thoughtful expression, Sherlock added, Miss Gemma, I think you remember how you repotted your mandrake, right? Even if the process was ugly, so what? What's buried in this oil is a plant that can grow. For the Slytherin team, these Nimbus 2001s are their new flower pots. Sherlock, you? Gemma hadn't expected that. Despite their different stances, Sherlock could offer such sincere advice. She looked at Sherlock with some emotion, about to say something heartfelt. Unexpectedly, Sherlock continued, however, in my personal opinion, You should give up as soon as possible, huh? Gemma was stunned. She looked at Sherlock in astonishment, completely bewildered by his sudden change of heart. As long as Harry performs normally, you guys are no match for him. PFFT. Gemma was immediately amused by Sherlock's words. You have that much confidence in your friend, the youngest seeker in a century, Miss Gemma. I don't think a single broom can separate him from Malfoy, but that's 7 brooms, excuse my bluntness, but in Quidditch, the seeker's role is, to some extent, more important than the other 6 combined. That being said, Sherlock, do you always talk like this? Gemma looked at Sherlock with a hint of helplessness. Has no one told you that you easily offend people like this? So what? Sherlock raised an eyebrow. Life is already so hard. If you have to care about what others think, that's a bit too tiring. Never mind. Gemma sighed deeply, gently smoothing her chestnut-colored hair. Since things have come to this, let's have a drink first. As she spoke, her gaze was fixed on the drink on the table, her eyes revealing a sense of desperation. Sherlock nodded, picked up the orange juice on the table, and downed it in one gulp, the bottom of the glass making a dull thud on the wooden table. Not bad. Gemma propped her chin on one hand, looking at Sherlock with interest. Aren't you worried I might add something to it? I told you last time, you're not that kind of person. Hearing this, Gemma's already bright eyes instantly shone even brighter. The smile on her lips became more pronounced, and she seemed to be infused with new vitality, unconsciously sitting up straighter. Seeing Gemma's expression, Sherlock smiled as well. Actually, compared to Chimerman, I think Chief Penelope's description of you is more accurate. Penelope? What did she say about me? Hearing Sherlock mention his old rival, Gemma immediately became interested. She said she hates guys with snake-shaped silver buckles, but you're like a moonfox who's infiltrated a snake's den. Moonfoxes are magical creatures widely distributed throughout the world, with pale gray bodies, smooth skin, 4 long, thin legs, 4 flat, large feet, and 2 large, round eyes on their heads. They are shy and only emerge from their caves on the night of a full moon. When bathed in moonlight, they will stand on their hind legs in secluded places and perform complex dances, which are quite captivating. Hearing this comparison, Gemma was first taken aback, then laughed, her voice as clear and melodious as a nightingale's. That Penelope, how did she come up with that? But, a cold glint suddenly flashed in her eyes, thinking my danger level is only, well, she's underestimating me. Sherlock frowned. He didn't understand how comparing someone to a moonfox was underestimating them. Shouldn't that be a compliment? Alright, it's about time. Gemma's smile faded, and she said quietly, if we don't leave soon, your friend might really start thinking I'm a dangerous chimera, don't you think? Whatever. By the time Sherlock and Gemma Farley returned to the Great Hall, the sun had already risen. Ron was nowhere to be seen, and Hermione was the only one left in the Great Hall. When Hermione saw Sherlock and Gemma, the anxiety in her eyes vanished, replaced by a look of relief. Gemma smiled and nodded at Hermione, then turned and left under the latter's wary gaze. Sherlock's gaze swept across the table. Ron went to the Quidditch pitch. He went to find Harry with bread and jam. Once Gemma was completely out of sight, Hermione said sternly, "You were gone for so long, what did you talk about with her?" "Just a trivial matter." Sherlock sat down and picked up a piece of toast. "Could you please pass me the applesauce, please?" Hermione handed Sherlock the applesauce, then stared intently at him, waiting for him to continue. "She came to see me again for counseling, but this time it's psychological counseling. Chapter 193. Since you asked so sincerely." Hermione frowned, sensing something more amiss. "She's a 6th-year student, and a Slytherin prefect. Why would she need to consult you?" "My dear Hermione, don't think of prefects as something sacred. She's just a 15-year-old girl. HMPH, she's still 3 years older than you." Hermione emphasized the words older and 3, then asked curiously, "So what's the matter with her?" "Those involved are often blinded, while bystanders see clearly," Sherlock said quietly. "Miss Gemma is a good person, and a true Slytherin. Unfortunately, she values Slytherin's honor too much, to the point of bearing responsibilities that shouldn't be hers." Hearing Sherlock's assessment of Gemma, Hermione's frown deepened, almost forming a deep frown. "Wait a minute, what did you call her for, Gemma?" "Yes, Hermione, you've found a blind spot again. This time it wasn't me who noticed." Hermione looked a little annoyed. "I didn't even notice. Ron pointed it out to me." "Ron? I didn't expect his observation skills to have improved," Sherlock said thoughtfully, then continued under Hermione's surprised gaze. As for the reason, it was her request. She brought it up during the summer vacation. Request? Summer vacation. Hermione's eyes widened in surprise, a sense of crisis quietly spreading in her heart. She took a deep breath and asked cautiously in a seemingly indifferent tone, Sherlock, when did you two become so close? Did you contact each other during the summer vacation? That's right, it was during the summer vacation. Sherlock didn't hide anything and directly told her about his frequent correspondence with Gemma during the summer vacation. He even mentioned that he had met with her specifically on the first night after arriving at school. Finally, under Hermione's surprised gaze, he said, "Come to think of it, it's rather surprising that she hasn't contacted me since." Silence. A long silence. Sherlock didn't speak, and neither did Hermione. Sherlock continued to eat his breakfast elegantly, while Hermione looked at him with a complex expression that was difficult to describe. Finally, Hermione couldn't help but ask, "So, what did Miss Farley want to see you about today?" Her voice sounded somewhat downcast. "Had so much already happened between them without my knowledge?" "Quidditch," Sherlock said succinctly. Malfoy's father bought every single member of the Slytherin Quidditch team a brand new Nimbus 2001 flying broomstick. A Nimbus 2001? One for each person? It seems Malfoy's father really went all out this time. Hermione recalled being aggressively sold broomsticks by shopkeepers in Diagon Alley with Sherlock, and looked at him with confusion. "But, what does this have to do with Farley asking you to? She couldn't possibly want you to persuade our Quidditch team to concede, could she?" "Of course not, my friend. Why would you think that?" Sherlock looked at Hermione with a puzzled expression. "Didn't you say that Miss Gemma Farley is a true Slytherin?" Hermione said this with a hint of sarcasm. "Isn't that what true Slytherins excel at, winning without fighting? I remember saying earlier that she came to me for counseling." Sherlock, however, didn't notice the change in Hermione's tone and continued calmly. "She thinks that Malfoy and his father's actions are detrimental to Slytherin's development because Malfoy originally possessed the qualities of a qualified seeker." After quickly recounting their conversation, Sherlock concluded, "Actually, her worries are unnecessary. Slytherin Quidditch is the strongest team, and with the help of Nimbus 2001, they are even more formidable. However, the rules of Quidditch dictate that the seeker is far more important than anyone else. Unfortunately, Gryffindor happens to have the best seeker in the entire school. The youngest seeker in a century is no exaggeration. Even 7 Nimbus 2001s wouldn't be enough to bridge the gap in skill between Malfoy and Harry." Sherlock paused here. "So my final advice is, Miss Gemma, you should give up your fantasies and face reality." "What reality? Forget about the championship. Maintaining second place in the Quidditch Cup standings is a victory for Slytherin." PFFT. Hearing Sherlock's words, Hermione finally couldn't help but laugh. At that moment, all her previous negative emotions vanished with a laugh. "Sherlock, you really are." She looked at Sherlock, unsure how to describe him. So Sherlock hadn't changed at all. He was still the great detective who could drive people crazy with just a few words. But when the person being angered wasn't herself, it actually felt quite good. Hermione pursed her lips. Shall we go to the library?" Sherlock didn't refuse. The two went to the library, just like last semester. As lunchtime approached, Hermione suddenly made a request that Sherlock hadn't expected. "Can you continue teaching me to fly this semester?" Hermione asked casually, but her face still flushed slightly. "Flying lessons have been cancelled this semester, but I don't want to end up like I did when we came back from Godric's Hollow." "No problem," Sherlock said without looking up. "The best way for you to overcome fear is to face it. Once you get used to being high up, you'll definitely be able to overcome your acrophobia." Hearing Sherlock's words, a clear smile appeared on Hermione's lips. However, before they went to the Quidditch pitch to practice flying that afternoon, they ran into dejected Harry and Ron, who was comforting him. "What happened?" Hermione asked in surprise when she saw the two of them. "Harry got points deducted again and is going to be put in timeout." Seeing Harry still looking down, Ron answered for him helplessly. "You'll never guess what happened at the Quidditch pitch." He couldn't help but look at Sherlock. Based on past experience, Sherlock would usually give the correct answer at such times. Sherlock didn't disappoint Ron. When Ron's gaze fell on Sherlock, Sherlock looked away from Harry and said in a light tone, "Harry arrived at the Quidditch pitch early, but he couldn't practice properly today. He got into a fight a while ago, which is why you mentioned he got points deducted and was put in detention. But Harry shouldn't be so resistant to points deducted in detention. So, let me guess, This time the detention isn't Hagrid, but Filch. Are you going to clean his trophies? No, it's worse than that, it's Professor Lockhart, Harry said with a bitter face. Professor McGonagall just told me that Professor Lockhart specifically asked me to help him. Hearing this, Sherlock immediately became interested. Professor Lockhart, what does he want your help with? Wait, just a minute. Ron looked at Sherlock with surprise. How do you know Harry didn't train today, and that he got points deducted for fighting? My dear Ron, are you sure you want me to explain these obvious facts? Sherlock's lips curled slightly, indicating his pleasure. Absolutely. Even if it makes you think I'm an idiot, Ron said firmly. All right, since you've asked so earnestly. Sherlock suddenly quickened his pace. Based on Harry's past training experience, normal training would leave a crescent-shaped indentation on the inside of his cloak from the friction of a broom handle, but there's nothing here. Besides, there are no sweat stains on Harry's uniform, and the cloak isn't wrinkled or dusty from wind or friction, which is enough to show that Harry didn't train today. As for the fight, it's also evident from his uniform and cloak. Here, and here, these torn areas have irregular tears, and the fabric is deformed. In Quidditch, if the damage was caused by a flying collision, the marks wouldn't be like this, they should be more dispersed, and the direction would be related to the force of the flight. But these tear marks are concentrated on the collar, cuffs, and chest, clearly from the close-quarters scuffle. Don't forget, when we first met, you already said that Harry had points deducted and would be put in solitary confinement. That makes it clear, Harry got into a fight on the Quidditch field today. Okay, you win, I'm just an idiot. After listening to Sherlock's analysis, Ron reluctantly admitted the truth. It's always like this. It's so obvious coming from you, but I just can't see anything until you say it. Ron, don't look at Sherlock like that, Hermione couldn't help but explain. Maybe you think Sherlock is showing off, but for him, saying these things is as simple as us saying the color of Harry's uniform. Ron shook his head with a wry smile and remained silent. Sherlock then turned back to Harry. All right, my dear Harry, can you tell me now why Professor Lockhart wanted you? Of course. Professor McGonagall said she specifically asked for me to reply to a letter from one of her admirers. What? Hermione was immediately astonished upon hearing Harry's words. Her eyes sparkled. Oh my God, such a good thing? I'd love to trade places with you. Give up, Hermione. You're not the savior of the wizarding world. Lockhart wouldn't want you. Chapter 194 Only being caught counts as violating school rules. Hermione glared at Ron immediately upon hearing his words. Ronald, shut up. Ron wanted to retort, but seeing Hermione's angry expression, he obediently shut up and said nothing more. After all, lies don't hurt, the truth is the sharpest knife. Sherlock clasped his hands together, leaned back slightly, and his gray eyes sparkled with curiosity, replying to fans' letters? That's interesting. So, dear Harry, please tell me what exactly happened on the pitch today. I'm very interested in it, so please be as detailed as possible and don't miss any details. Thank goodness, Sherlock, you finally asked that. Ron looked at Sherlock and Hermione and said helplessly, I asked him a long time ago, but old Harry insisted on waiting until both of you are here before he would tell me. I just didn't want to tell the same thing twice, Harry said with a rare serious expression. The four returned to the Gryffindor common room, and as Sherlock had requested, Harry began to recount the day's events from the beginning. As is customary, the use of the Hogwarts Quidditch pitch is always on a first-come, first-served basis. That is, whoever arrives first practices first, much like reserving a pitch in the Muggle world. But Oliver Wood got up early for more than just that. He had already applied to Madame Hooch yesterday. He not only wanted to train, but he also wanted to have the pitch to himself. This seemingly extravagant move was intended to study and implement Gryffindor's latest tactics, preventing other houses from spying on them. After all, the Quidditch pitch is very large. Without reserving it, there would be more than enough space for all four Hogwarts teams to practice simultaneously. Unexpectedly, Slytherin House took an unconventional approach, arriving at the pitch with a note from Professor Snape. Harry then pushed a note towards Sherlock. I, Professor Severus Snape, hereby authorize the Slytherin team to practice at the Quidditch pitch today to train their new seeker. Sherlock glanced at it and nodded slightly. It is indeed Professor Snape's handwriting. After saying this, he carefully folded the note and put it in his pocket. Hermione, seeing Sherlock's actions, asked with some confusion, Are you worried that Marcus Flint will forge it? I don't think he has the guts, my dear Hermione. You're absolutely right. Flint certainly doesn't have the guts. Sherlock smiled slightly. I put it away to copy. Copy? Hermione looked at Sherlock, her eyes full of surprise. You said copy? My language system and your hearing system are both perfectly normal. I did just say copy. Why? My dear friend, you see, although Professor Snape's handwriting is easy to recognize, the way people write varies slightly depending on their emotions. Notice the strokes here, they're more flamboyant than Professor Snape's handwriting on the parchment in the Philosopher's Stone room last semester. And here, look at this transition, subtle yet powerful. It proves he was in a good mood when he wrote this note. So, to copy his handwriting, you need more handwriting from different situations. Who asked you that? Hermione could no longer contain her urge to retort. I asked why you even thought of copying a professor's handwriting. What are you trying to do? Dear Hermione, I'm asking you to fully utilize your imagination. A professor's signature has so many uses. For example, next time Harry goes to practice, he can prepare a note beforehand. That way, he won't have to worry about being disturbed by other houses when he has the place to himself. Or, if we want to look up information in the restricted section, a professor's signature can save us a lot of trouble. And also, enough. Hearing this, Hermione interrupted him speechlessly. Sherlock, you're incredibly audacious. This isn't just a simple violation of school rules. You dare to do this. For a moment, Hermione didn't know how to describe Sherlock's behavior. So, you left that parchment for this? And you're even analyzing the subtle differences between the two handwritings in different situations. It's unbelievable. Harry and Ron looked at Sherlock with admiration. Typical Sherlock. No wonder you came to Gryffindor instead of Ravenclaw. The Sorting Hat was right. Hermione, you don't need to be so nervous, Harry kindly comforted her. Getting caught is considered a violation of school rules. As long as you don't get caught, nothing happens. Oh my God. Harry, I really can't believe it. How could you think like that? Who taught you that? Sherlock, Hermione. Seeing that Hermione seemed to have fallen into a state of self-isolation, Harry ignored her and continued talking about what happened that morning. Professor Snape was not only the potions professor but also the head of Slytherin House. In the administrative structure of Hogwarts School, after the headmaster are the heads of the 4 houses, and then the other teachers. Professor McGonagall is only slightly higher than the heads of the other 3 houses because she is also the vice-headmaster. In any case, as the flying teacher, Madam Hooch could not possibly disrespect Professor Snape. So she could only let the Slytherin Quidditch team break in even though Gryffindor had already booked the entire house. When Harry got to this point, Ron got excited. Sherlock, Hermione, you might not believe it, but Slytherin's new seeker is Draco Malfoy. And his father even bought a Nimbus 2001 for every member of the Slytherin team. Hermione, having recovered from her sullen state, said with a helpless expression, Ron, can you please stop interrupting and let Harry finish? No way. Ron's eyes widened, looking indignant. That's a Nimbus 2001. The latest model from the Nimbus series this year. It flies faster and more steadily than last year's Nimbus 2000. Malfoy's father really went all out this time, buying one for everyone on the team. This is really, at this point, Ron suddenly realized what Hermione had just said. Wait, what did you just say? How do you know about this? His gaze darted back and forth between Sherlock and Hermione, then a look of sudden realization crossed his face. I know, Sherlock must have told you, right, let me think. Sherlock must have noticed beforehand that the Slytherin team was different from last year through observation. Then, with his clever mind, he analyzed it a little and deduced this. No, this wasn't Sherlock's deduction. Hermione's expression was somewhat subtle. It was the Slytherin prefect who told him. You mean Gemma Farley? Ron's surprise deepened. She went to see Sherlock today just to talk about this. What else? Hermione chuckled, her expression somewhat similar to Sherlock's. Unfortunately, never mind, let's not talk about this anymore. Please don't interrupt Harry, let him continue. Okay, Ron, who had originally planned to share some exciting news, suddenly became dejected. Strange, why do I always feel like an outsider? Harry continued talking about what happened this morning. The Gryffindor Quidditch team, led by Oliver Wood, and the Slytherin team, led by Marcus Flint, were facing off on the pitch, and the relationship between the two sides was already somewhat tense. Immediately afterward, the Slytherin players, wielding the latest Nimbus 2001, began mocking the Gryffindor Quidditch players' outdated flying brooms. They claimed it was far faster than the original, best Nimbus 2000 series, and that the Weasley Brothers' old-fashioned sweeper series was only fit for sweeping floors. This further heightened attention. Just then, someone no one expected suddenly appeared, becoming the catalyst for the fight. That person was Colin Creevey, the Muggle-born first-year Gryffindor student. "Why is Creevey at the Quidditch pitch?" Hermione suddenly interjected. "This has nothing to do with him, he won't let others interrupt, yet he keeps asking questions," Ron muttered quietly from the side. Harry pretended not to hear. "That's because I ran into him when I went out this morning. He heard I was going to Quidditch practice, so he followed me. When we were flying over the Quidditch pitch, he took pictures of me with his camera, and would mistook him for a Slytherin spy." PFFT Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione all looked at Ron simultaneously. "Sorry, I just remembered something happy." Harry looked away somewhat helplessly. He was completely used to being interrupted repeatedly. "Just as I was explaining to Wood that Colin Creevey wasn't a Slytherin spy, the Slytherin men arrived at the pitch. Sherlock, as you said, I was only flying over the pitch for a maximum of 10 minutes, maybe even less." Wood stopped practice immediately when he saw the Slytherins. He angrily declared he'd booked the pitch, but Flint and the others pulled out a note from Professor Snape, introduced a new chaser, and mocked our flying broomsticks. Just then, Colin, who had been taking pictures, saw us stop and ran straight onto the pitch. I believe he meant well, wanting to protect us, but Harry gave a wry smile. Recalling the situation with a wry smile, he publicly questioned Malfoy's abilities, saying he only got into the Quidditch team by paying money. "Well done," Ron exclaimed excitedly. "That kid truly lives up to his Gryffindor roots. He didn't embarrass us at all." I recommend a new book by a longtime friend, a veteran author of the multiverse infinite flow genre, with excellent urban scenes, quality guaranteed. Chapter 195 The King of Fighters. If it were me, I probably would have said that too, right? Hermione was also somewhat surprised, clearly not expecting Colin to be so bold. Sherlock nodded slightly. This wasn't the first time Colin had done something like this. From this perspective alone, the Sorting Hat was indeed right to send him to Gryffindor. As a result, Malfoy got furious and publicly called him a mudblood. After Ron's explanation last semester, Hermione knew that this term was the most insulting name. Her face changed instantly, and she covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh my god, how dare he?" "Maybe he felt protected by the other Slytherin members," Ron said subconsciously. The Gryffindor team also had 3 female members. If the two sides really fought, Slytherin would naturally have the advantage. Harry nodded and continued, "We were all furious. Flint had to rush in front of Malfoy to protect him and prevent Fred and George from pounce on him. Arya, Angelina, and Kitty rushed in too, but the Slytherins held them off." Harry paused, then suddenly became a little embarrassed. "Well, actually, I didn't intend to fight. But Malfoy thought he was safe because they were protecting him, and he kept provoking me. Seeing his smug look, I couldn't stand it, so I used the move Sherlock taught me to beat him up." "The move I taught you, which one?" Hearing Harry's explanation, Sherlock immediately became interested. Hermione and Ron also stared intently at Harry, waiting for him to continue. "Put your left foot under your weight, bend your right leg slightly to make it easier to extend and retract. Use not only your hands and arms, but your whole body to hide him in the chin from below," Harry said seriously. "That's how I hide him with all my might." As he said this, Harry couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. That scene was still deeply etched in his mind. Immediately after he threw that decisive punch, he heard the sound of teeth clashing. Malfoy's tongue was undoubtedly broken by the impact. He cried out, raised his hands and flailed in the air a few times, and then collapsed to the ground with a thud. Everyone was stunned by this scene. No one could have imagined that Harry's punch could cause such damage, directly knocking out Malfoy. "Well done," Sherlock smiled with satisfaction. From Harry's description, it was just a regular uppercut. But then again, theory is one thing, and being able to actually do it is another. To seize the opportunity to attack successfully in such a chaotic situation, and to kill with a single blow. This savior of the wizarding world, after following them for so long, has finally improved. Hermione and Ron nodded repeatedly. However, hitting someone is still wrong. Hermione laughed after saying this. Next time, if you're going to fight, it's best to do it like Sherlock did, and not get caught." Harry gave a wry smile. He felt Hermione was absolutely right. It was certainly exhilarating to fight, But the punishment afterward was rather unfair. Gryffindor lost 30 points. That wasn't a big deal, compared to knocking out Malfoy with one punch. 30 points, 50 points, or even more wouldn't matter. Solitary confinement wasn't a major problem either. Sherlock had already shown him last year, wasn't it just going to the Forbidden Forest with Hagrid? As long as he stayed with Hagrid and didn't wander off, even going to the dangerous Forbidden Forest felt like coming home. But he never expected that this time the confinement would involve helping Professor Lockhart reply to a letter. That's going too far. Harry could swear on his grandfather's name that when Professor McGonagall said, "Professor Lockhart specifically asked for you," he wished he could go back in time and take back the punch he'd landed on Malfoy's chin. Admittedly, Professor Lockhart had proven his abilities through lesson after lesson in defense against the dark arts. But helping Lockhart reply to his admirer's letter, just thinking about it made Harry's head spin. "My dear Harry, it's not a big deal," Sherlock advised directly, here in Harry's description. "I think you should seize this opportunity to learn some skills from him. I'm sure Professor Lockhart would be happy to share his experience with you." Skills? What skills? Not only Harry, but Hermione and Ron also looked surprised. Having Lockhart tutor Harry? That was indeed a good idea. Given Professor Lockhart's current abilities, he certainly had the capacity. But Harry was specifically asked to go there to write a letter. Would Lockhart teach him at a time like this? "No, I'm not referring to magic." Sherlock, seeing the three's gazes, immediately understood their thoughts. "I mean, you can ask him how to deal with those enthusiastic fans, like that little guy over there with the camera." The three looked in the direction Sherlock pointed and saw Colin Creevey standing at the common room door, grinning foolishly as he walked towards them. "Oh no, bloody hell, oh no, he's here again." Harry's face changed instantly, and without a word, he took off running. "Harry, don't go. Wait for me. I came here specifically to thank you." Harry's original plan was to run out of the classroom before Colin could react. Unfortunately, Colin was too talented at being a paparazzi, and he had already blocked Harry's escape route. Plus, the common room was tiny, so the result was, he ran, he chased, he couldn't escape. Finally, facing Colin's undiminished, gleeful enthusiasm, Harry sighed deeply. He resigned himself to his fate. Seeing Harry stop, Colin grabbed his arm, excitedly saying, "Harry, this was so much fun. Are you deliberately testing my reflexes? Come to think of it, thank you so much for today. And, you know what? Your performance on the field has spread everywhere, everyone's calling you a hero, blah blah blah." Harry looked at the overly enthusiastic Colin with despair. He really wanted to shake Colin off and turn away. But as the saying goes, you can't hide a smiling face, and Harry wasn't good at saying no, so he had no idea how to deal with this enthusiastic younger brother. Especially since Colin was genuinely grateful. In the end, Harry could only feign politeness and force a smile. He subconsciously glanced at Sherlock, only to find the latter looking at him meaningfully. Harry suddenly understood. Sherlock's words to him flashed through his mind. Perhaps, he really could learn from Professor Lockhart how to deal with such crazed fans. Colin kept pestering Harry with questions. Fortunately, not long after, the Gryffindor Quidditch team arrived in the common room to celebrate Harry's successful beating of Malfoy. Colin then stopped and, as the person involved, told the other Gryffindors about Harry's heroic deeds. Harry was initially happy that his teammates had helped him get rid of Colin's harassment. Who knew that this celebration would give him a new nickname in addition to Savior of the Wizarding World, the Boy Who Lived, and the Dark Lord's nemesis, the King of Fighters? Although Harry strongly opposed this seemingly unreliable title, the Weasley twins egged him on, and the nickname was settled. The King of Fighters, Harry, long live the King of Fighters. It wasn't until Harry told everyone he was going to be put in detention that the others let him go. "Wait, Holmes, no, the Lion King can't leave." "That's right, we've all heard. You taught Harry that punch, no wonder he's the Lion King. Teach us too." "I've suddenly realized that punching people is quite fun, more so than magic." Seeing this, Harry sighed deeply and left the common room alone for the Great Hall. After a quick dinner, he rested in his dormitory for a while, until just a few minutes before 8 o'clock, when he reluctantly dragged his feet up to the third floor. That was the Hogwarts Defense Against the Dark Arts professor's office. Last year, Quirrell was there. This year, Lockhart was there. Thinking about this, Harry's mood became somewhat complicated. Come to think of it, in a way, Voldemort spent a whole year in this office last year. Judging from the confrontation with him last year, this guy didn't seem as powerful as the legends said. So, could he have left some kind of backup plan in his office? Just as Harry was lost in thought, a figure suddenly appeared from the side. Harry almost cried out in surprise until he saw who it was. "Hey! What are you doing?" Harry, already feeling down, couldn't help but feel a little aggrieved. "Hermione, you startled me." Hermione looked around nervously, as if afraid of being discovered. "They're still celebrating. I snuck out to help you." "Huh?" Harry looked puzzled. "Help me? I mean, I can go with you to Professor Lockhart's office to help him." "Oh no, I mean help you write some fan replies." Hermione's eyes sparkled, and her face showed anticipation. Okay, Harry agreed without hesitation. "Thank you Jiraiya for the 100 Kidian coins reward. Your support is my motivation to update." Oh. Chapter 196 Celebrities Should Act Like Celebrities. Nearly a month into the semester, Harry had come to believe that Gilderoy Lockhart was a capable defense against the dark arts professor. But one thing was one thing. The thought of replying to his admirer still felt like a nightmare. Whether Hermione's eagerness was to help him or Professor Lockhart was irrelevant. As long as she was willing to share the burden of writing the letter, she was his best friend. "But I don't know if he'll agree," Harry said, somewhat hesitant. "Don't be like that, Harry. How will you know if you don't try? But you can't tell anyone about this." Okay. Harry felt Hermione's tone sounded exactly like a criminal on TV trying to lure minors. The two walked together down the long third-floor corridor towards Lockhart's office. "The defense against the dark arts professor at Hogwarts changes all the time," Hermione said as they walked, "so each professor decorates their office according to their own tastes and preferences. I wonder what Professor Lockhart's office will look like." Seeing Hermione's excited expression, Harry remained expressionless. "I'm not looking forward to it at all." When they reached Professor Lockhart's office, they stopped. Seeing Harry's inaction, Hermione looked at him with some confusion. "Harry," meeting Hermione's encouraging gaze, Harry gritted his teeth and finally knocked on the door. The door opened almost instantly. Gilderoy Lockhart's smiling face came into view. "Oh, the little rascal is here. Harry, come in." "Harry, Hermione." "Oh." Lockhart only noticed Hermione standing next to Harry after saying this, and was immediately surprised. "Miss Granger. What are you doing here?" Hermione, Cyrillic lettered X. Although she felt a little wronged, Hermione suppressed her negative emotions and asked cautiously, Professor, I'd like to help you write your reply with Harry. Is that alright?" Harry also looked at Lockhart with hopeful eyes. In that instant, he had seen the entire Lockhart office. Just as Hermione had said before, Lockhart had rearranged the office according to his own preferences. The whole office gave the impression of being gaudy and cluttered. Countless framed pictures of Lockhart hung on the walls, brightly lit by many candles, some even bearing his signature, and a large stack of photos lay on the desk. However, this was nothing compared to what was going on. What terrified Harry most was that the office wasn't small. In fact, it was quite spacious. Even so, it was overflowing with countless letters and packages. If he had to reply to all these people, Harry couldn't help but shudder. At this moment, he desperately hoped Hermione could help him share some of the burden. Considering Hermione's excellent performance in defense against the dark arts, "Please agree, Professor Lockhart." Harry prayed silently. After all, she was the only student who remembered all his preferences. However, Lockhart then said something that surprised both Harry and Hermione. "Dear Miss Granger, while I'm very happy you've come, I must apologize, Professor." Hermione looked at Lockhart in surprise, seemingly not expecting him to refuse so decisively. "Having Harry help me reply to the fans' letters is actually Professor McGonagall's punishment for putting him in detention. I think you both know that." Harry and Hermione nodded. "That's why I can't ask anyone else to do this, even if you're willing, but, good girl, don't worry. Replying to fans isn't something that can be done overnight." Lockhart smiled at Hermione and winked. "Next time I need to reply to my fans, I'll definitely ask you. Then it won't be a punishment, but a request for your help. It would be an honor for me to have the best student in the whole grade help me." It has to be said that as the author of Master of Charismatic Conversation, Lockhart is quite skilled. With just 2 simple sentences, he turned Hermione's mood from low to happy, and she obediently left. After Hermione left, Lockhart turned to Harry, his face once again beaming with a bright smile. "What are you still standing there for? "Come in, my dear Harry." After Harry entered the room, Lockhart immediately closed the door, excitedly rubbing his hands together and said, "I think you can write in an envelope." To be honest, his tone was strange, as if it were some kind of great honor. Harry had no idea where his confidence came from. Indeed, this man was just as Sherlock had said, truly contradictory. "Well, let me see," Lockhart muttered as he flipped through the envelopes. "The first one will be for Lady Gladys, God bless her, she's one of my most ardent admirers." Remembering Sherlock's earlier words and the recent entanglement with Colin, Harry frowned, an idea forming in his mind. He quickly finished writing the envelope. Then, before Lockhart could hand him the other envelope, he spoke first. "Professor, I actually have a question I'd like to ask you." Lockhart was clearly surprised that Harry had spoken up. However, he quickly showed delight. "I didn't expect the savior of the wizarding world to have questions." "Don't worry, dear Harry, with my vast life experience, I'm sure I can answer all your questions. It's like this, there's a student in our house who really likes..." Harry's thick skin still needed some work. He paused here. "Well, I don't really know how to put it, but he keeps asking me to take pictures and sign autographs, and he even shows up on my daily route. It's even affecting my normal life." Compared to Harry, Lockhart was much more experienced. Hearing this, he already understood what was going on. "I think you're talking about Mr. Colin Creevey, right? The one who took a picture with us, that rabid fan." "That's right, him." Harry nodded repeatedly. He didn't correct Lockhart's description. This time, Lockhart's description wasn't wrong at all. "Very good, dear Harry, it seems you finally realized the weight of fame is a double-edged sword. As your teacher, I have to impart some experience of being a celebrity to you." Lockhart straightened his collar, revealing his signature smile. "I once rode in dances with werewolves. Fame is like sniffing out coins from a pocket. If you're not careful, it will bite your finger." Entering his area of expertise, Lockhart's imposing presence shone through, radiating an aura of dominance that surprisingly resonated with Harry. "Harry, remember, celebrities have to maintain a certain air. You just said Mr. Creevey affected your normal life? In my opinion, that's nothing. Once, a fan even tried to break into my bathroom while I was showering to get my autograph. If it were just that, it wouldn't be so bad, but do you know what? She even brought a love potion." Hearing this, Harry was stunned. "A love potion?" Professor Lockhart winked at a surprised Harry. "Mason's beard. Actually, I shouldn't be saying this to a student. It's way too early for you right now. I mean, when Mr. Creevey rushes at you with his camera, you should keep your distance like you would a mandrake seedling. Professor, you might as well be more direct. You need to raise your chin so high you can see the top of the tower, understand? Look down at the camera with that I just saved the wizarding world from the void look. When he says, Mr. Potter, please give me your autograph, the correct response is to reply in a short, powerful, almost magical tone, defense against the dark arts in 5 minutes, and then stride away. If you're stuck on the spiral staircase, you can even tell him in a cold tone, Mr. Creevey, your persistence is wearing down the savior's patience. Under Harry's look of utter disbelief, Lockhart said in an unquestionable tone, Harry, you must remember, every overly enthusiastic photo has the potential to become venom in the future. Only when the fans are feeling frustrated should you show your approachability. Make them feel that the idol himself is willing to get close to them, but for various reasons cannot actually do so. Even if you really do something wrong, you should let the fans spontaneously defend you, and if necessary, you can even plant, cough cough. Of course, it's a bit too early to tell you that now. In the end, it still comes down to this, a celebrity must have the airs of a celebrity. After saying this, Lockhart straightened up, resuming his elegant posture, and casually straightened his violet robe. Now, I think we can practice how to express I'm busy with our nostrils. While a stunned Harry received Lockhart's expert advice, Hermione, rejected by Lockhart, left the office somewhat dejectedly and returned to the Gryffindor common room. When she saw the familiar figure with his hands clasped together and chin resting on his hand, Hermione was not surprised. Professor Lockhart refused me. She sat down next to Sherlock and briefly recounted her experience. However, he promised me that if the opportunity arises again, he will definitely ask for my help next time. Next time? That's to be expected. You already guessed this outcome, so why didn't you try to dissuade me when I went to Harry? If I had persuaded you, would you have given up? Hermione pondered for a moment and shook her head. No, After saying those two words, she couldn't help but smile, understanding Sherlock's meaning. Speaking of which, I'm quite stubborn in this regard. That's not surprising, Hermione. Actually, Gilderoy Lockhart is a very interesting person. Interesting? Hermione looked at her friend with some confusion. Sherlock, could you be a little clearer? Thank you for reading at work and rewarding Sherlock Holmes with 100 Kidian coins. Your support is my motivation to update. Oh. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 197. Let me tear you apart. In the Gryffindor common room, Sherlock calmly recounted his observations of Gilderoy Lockhart to Hermione. From the very first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, Professor Lockhart has struck me as a walking contradiction. The things students dislike most are precisely what he loves most. And the things students love are precisely what he despises. How could that be? Hermione exclaimed, her eyes wide with surprise. You say he enjoys promoting his adventures, but the process of teaching, you say he doesn't enjoy it. Don't doubt my judgment, dear Hermione. Based on his performance since the start of the school year, Professor Lockhart is undoubtedly a competent Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. However, his interest in teaching itself is far less than in promoting himself and his works. I think you remember what I said to Harry in Diagon Alley, didn't you? The reason he took a picture with Harry and gave him his entire collection of books wasn't out of charity, but to leverage Harry's fame for his own greater success. His behavior at school only confirms this, his excessive embellishment of his adventures in every class, having everyone act out the stories from the book with him. If he didn't genuinely enjoy it, why would he do that? I can sense that he's genuinely happy doing these things. Conversely, when using magic, he seems to have a strange resistance, but he clearly teaches us some real skills in every class. Look, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Sherlock looked at Hermione with a half-smile. Even a fervent admirer like you knows which knowledge in class is truly useful. Think about it carefully. Without those classroom contents, would the other wizards still cooperate with him like this? Hermione didn't speak. She tacitly agreed. So, there's only one truth, Sherlock said slowly. Giddy Lockhart came to the school not to teach at all. Hermione was stunned. It wasn't her fault. Anyone would feel the same way upon hearing that a professor came to the school not to teach. You don't need to be so surprised. It's an exchange of interests, each getting what they need, Sherlock said quietly. This is the fundamental logic of how society works. Hermione remained silent. By the way, there's more than one suspicious point about Professor Lockhart. Suspicious point? Yes, he's from Ravenclaw, and coincidentally, he was Professor Flitwick's former student, so I specifically asked him for his opinion of the professor. I think you'll find that interesting. Tell me, Lockhart was an extremely bright student in his school days. Other teachers, including Professor Flitwick, believed his talent surpassed most students. If he had studied diligently, he would certainly have achieved great things in the future. Unfortunately, he preferred to focus his energy on other things. For example, his annual final exams. He always got a no in charms, while his other courses were mostly E's or A's. Professor Flitwick believed this was because the charms professor was the head of Ravenclaw, showing his strong ambition. In 5th year, he made the prefect willingly relinquish this position. In 7th year, he did it again, making the student council president give up his position once more. Even at the start of this school year, Professor Flitwick still couldn't understand why Headmaster Dumbledore had made Lockhart the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Hermione was stunned after hearing Sherlock's analysis. Sherlock, you mean, I told you, don't look at me with that surprised look, dear Hermione. In fact, whatever secrets Lockhart holds, as long as they don't harm us, I don't mind him keeping them. Compared to Quirrell last year, Professor Lockhart can teach us something truly useful. As Professor Flitwick said, in Hogwarts, everyone has their own secrets. That's what Professor Flitwick meant too. Hermione left in a daze. What Sherlock said today had deeply affected her. She needed time to process it. Watching Hermione's departing figure, Sherlock clasped his hands together, resting his chin on them, and fell into deep thought again. Time slipped by unnoticed. When Harry, his arm too heavy to lift, trudged wearily back to the Gryffindor Tower from Lockhart's office, and saw Sherlock alone in the common room, He almost cried with emotion. "Sherlock," Harry called softly as he approached Sherlock. "You're back." Sherlock checked the time, then looked at Harry. "Judging from the range of motion in your right hand, Lockhart has more fans than I thought, but you've returned earlier than I expected." Harry didn't pay attention to Sherlock's analysis. His voice trembled slightly. "Sherlock, were you waiting for me here?" "No, I was just lost in thought after Hermione left." The air suddenly went silent. Harry decided to put the matter aside for now. He said to Sherlock, "Sherlock, if you're not too tired, I have something important to tell you." "Go ahead." Hearing Harry say this, Sherlock's eyes lit up. He sensed an air of adventure. "I just heard something strange in Lockhart's office." Harry paused for a moment, seemingly considering how to describe it. It was a voice, a chilling, breathless, cold and malevolent voice. "I heard it say, come here, let me tear you, rip you apart, kill you." "But Lockhart says he didn't hear anything." Harry spoke with a hint of nervousness. "He said I was just sleepy because I'd been there for 4 hours, but I know that's not it. I swear, I heard it clearly." Sherlock didn't speak, just looked at Harry quietly. "Really, Sherlock, you have to believe me. Tell me everything that happened from the moment you entered Professor Lockhart's office, as detailed as possible. Don't leave out any details." Hearing Sherlock's words, Harry immediately perked up. "Okay, you see, the last time Sherlock said something like this was in the Greek interpreter case, before that in the Cho Chang-I shadow theft case, and before that in the case of Hannah Abbott's father being framed. So when Sherlock said something like this, it meant he was serious." Harry composed himself and began by recounting how he and Hermione had gone to Lockhart's office, where Hermione was asked to leave by Lockhart. He then explained how, following Sherlock's instructions, he had consulted Lockhart on how to deal with fervent fans like Colin Creevey. After that, he recounted how he had helped Lockhart write replies to his fans, writing hundreds, even 1,000. Just as he was exhausted and about to give up, he suddenly heard that voice. At first, Harry thought it was his imagination. But when he snapped back to reality, he heard the voice more clearly. However, Lockhart not only didn't hear anything, but also said that Harry was hallucinating from exhaustion and let him leave. After saying this, Harry suddenly realized, "Oh no. I promised Hermione I wouldn't tell anyone about this. Oh well, Sherlock isn't exactly anyone, so I might as well tell him. No wonder you came back earlier than I expected. So, apart from what you just said, you haven't heard that voice again?" "Yes." "What else did Professor Lockhart say?" "He told me to go back and rest." "Can you tell which direction the voice came from?" "I can't tell." Harry looked apologetic. He could sense that Sherlock trusted him. Unfortunately, he couldn't offer any constructive advice. "Come here, let me tear you apart, let me kill you." Sherlock rested his chin on his hands, softly repeating the short phrase Harry had just uttered. "It sounds stupid to anyone, like someone yelling stop, in the street," Sherlock commented, then asked, "So, have you ever heard a similar voice before?" "What?" Harry was taken aback. He hadn't expected Sherlock to ask that question. "My dear Harry, I've told you before that when you eliminate all the impossibilities, what remains, however unbelievable, must be the truth. So let's begin our deduction. First, let's rule out that this is your hallucination." Harry nodded repeatedly. "I'm sure it's not a hallucination." Second, let's assume Professor Lockhart really didn't hear the voice. "I don't think he's lying. His surprised expression doesn't seem fake." "Very good. If we eliminate all of these assumptions, then it means you can hear a voice that no one else can hear, and this voice is likely made by a strange creature." "Yes, that's it." Harry excitedly raised his fist. "Sherlock, as expected of you, you saw the truth right away." "No." "Huh?" "I said no. This isn't necessarily the truth." Harry looked at Sherlock with "Are you kidding me? Look, haven't we eliminated all the assumptions?" "Really?" Hearing Harry's words, Sherlock suddenly laughed. "What if I propose other assumptions? For example, what if you're lying to me about the whole thing?" "Sherlock," Harry was furious. "I'd never lie to you, no matter who I lie to." Harry was not only angry but also felt incredibly wronged. How could Sherlock do this? Since meeting him, he had considered him his best friend in the world. They had been through so much together last year, how could he not trust him? For a moment, Harry even felt like crying. Sherlock, however, seemed oblivious to Harry's emotions. "Dear Harry, of course I believe you wouldn't lie to me, but what if this wasn't your intentional act?" What? Harry understood every single word Sherlock spoke, But when they were put together, he realized he didn't understand. Thanks to Quing Shui Zhiz for the 500 Kidian coins reward for Gemma Farley. Your support is my motivation to update. Oh. Chapter 198. Just bear with it and you'll feel better. My dear Harry, first of all, thank you for your trust in me. Sherlock slowly rose to his feet, his long robes gleaming coldly in the moonlight streaming into the common room through the window. Your honesty is beyond question, but please remember the great limitations of human senses. What one sees and hears may very well be carefully orchestrated by others, intentionally presented to you and transmitted to your ears. Harry stared at Sherlock. I don't quite understand what you mean. In fact, looking back on the many cases I've handled, similar situations are commonplace. Those goldfish at Scotland Yard thought they had the whole story in mind, and were smug about it all day long. Little did they know they were completely manipulated by the criminals, no different from puppets on strings. Sherlock paused, a complex look appearing in his eyes. Brother, we're in the wizarding world now, and the situation is far more complicated than before. You've been in Lockhart's office for almost 4 hours. If he really wanted to do something to you, neither of us would necessarily have noticed. Don't forget, he's the defense against the dark arts professor. Sherlock's gaze was deep and meaningful as he stared at Harry. I don't believe a defense against the dark arts professor wouldn't know about the dark arts. After he said this, Harry felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. Sherlock, Harry suddenly realized that he couldn't refute Sherlock. This fact was hard for him to accept. Of course, you don't need to be too nervous. At least from what I've observed since you came in, you're perfectly normal, no different from usual. Even if that professor really had such abilities, he wouldn't have enough motivation to do it. After all, so far, you've cooperated with him quite well. Besides, you have the protection of your great mother. Sherlock chuckled softly when he saw that Harry seemed frightened. I just wanted to show you that eliminating all the impossible isn't as simple as you think. Even I need time to figure this out. That's why I asked you if you'd heard anything like it before. Although the question was back to the latest development, Harry was now somewhat insecure because of Sherlock, his voice hesitant as he spoke. I'm not sure. It seems like yes, and it seems like no. Sorry, Sherlock, I can't remember. Don't look so down. Have a drink. Sherlock suddenly smiled. We'll talk about this later. After this, we should go to sleep. Full of questions, Harry put on his pajamas and lay down on the bed. The only thing he'd gained from Lockhart today was learning how to deal with Colin Creevey. Hopefully, his method would work. Replying to Lockhart was exhausting, his arm was still numb. So, despite his troubled mind, Harry fell asleep within minutes. Hearing the soft breathing beside him, Sherlock smiled slightly. Harry could hear sounds others couldn't and see creatures others couldn't. It seemed his second year at Hogwarts wouldn't be any less boring than his first. Magic, how interesting. Time flew by, and a month had passed in the blink of an eye. When October arrived, a flu epidemic suddenly swept through Hogwarts, afflicting both staff and students. In Sherlock's dormitory, only he and Harry escaped. Ron, Neville, and Dean all succumbed. The other houses and years fared much better. This made Bobby Pomfrey, the school doctor and head nurse, the busiest person. For this, Pomfrey concocted a special potion. Despite its name, it was actually a magical potion used to treat the common cold. It worked well. Once ingested, it warmed the body, and the ears would smoke for hours. Sherlock was playing the violin. The sawing wood-like sound was unbearable for everyone in the dormitory. But they all knew that was how Sherlock played the violin. It was indeed painful at first, but it would pass if you just endured it. Once you got past this stage, the rest of the time was quite enjoyable. Sure enough, after satisfying himself, Sherlock played a nice piece of music as compensation. The three of them immediately relaxed. That felt good. After the music ended, a radiant Harry looked at the sickly Ron and couldn't help but say, Ron, you really should come with us for our morning exercise, that way you might not have caught a cold. You always say next time, but you never actually come with us, because of his stuffy nose. Ron's voice was muffled. Next time. Trust me, Harry, this time it's absolutely true. Harry, I don't believe you. Neville, who was standing nearby, overheard the conversation between the two and secretly glanced at Sherlock. Sherlock put down his violin and turned to Neville, saying, No problem, Neville, you can join us for morning exercises starting tomorrow. Neville, who had been lying in bed, was startled at first, but then sat bolt upright. staring at Sherlock in shock, and exclaimed, "A running gargan." Harry and Ron's attention was drawn to Neville's movement. "Neville, what's wrong?" Neville was stunned for a moment before stammering, "As Sherlock said what I was thinking. But I didn't say anything." Harry and Ron were also stunned. "What's going on, Sherlock?" After a moment, Ron couldn't help but exclaim, "This is so unexpected." Whenever something like this happened, Ron would become energetic. This time was no exception. Even a cold couldn't stop him. Harry didn't speak, but his eyes were fixed on Sherlock. Clearly, he also wanted to know how Sherlock had read Neville's mind without him saying a word. Seeing the puzzled looks on his three roommates' faces, Sherlock laughed heartily. "My dear Ron, I think you remember something." "What?" "Not long ago, Hermione and I discussed a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, in which someone deduces the unspoken thoughts of his companions. You thought it was just a clever trick by the author, like Lockhart in his novels. I told you then that I had the same habit of reasoning, but you didn't believe me." Ron frantically waved his hands. I didn't. Don't talk nonsense. You didn't say it aloud, my dear Ron. But I'm sure you thought it. So, when I saw Neville deep in thought just now, I was happy to have the opportunity to discuss it." Sherlock then looked at Harry. "That's precisely where Harry differs from you. He always has unwavering faith in my deductions." Harry, oh, Ron and Neville exchanged glances, momentarily at a loss for words. Seeing their expressions, Sherlock couldn't help but burst into laughter. "Guys, if you don't believe me, let's make a bet. If my conclusion convinces you, you'll have to drink some energy potion. I've had enough of you guys blowing your noses and yawning all day in the dorms. It always reminds me of those patients experiencing withdrawal symptoms." The two exchanged glances and then nodded in agreement. At this moment, Harry, who had just shown a satisfied look in his eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Sherlock, if I remember correctly, the example you and Hermione discussed isn't the same as the current situation." "My dear Harry, why don't you put it more clearly?" Meeting Sherlock's encouraging gaze, Harry boldly said, "The reasoner you mentioned drew his conclusion by observing his companion's actions. If I remember correctly, his companion tripped over a pile of stones, or looked up at the stars, and so on. But Neville has been lying quietly in bed the whole time. What clues does that give you?" Neville didn't speak, but he nodded repeatedly, clearly agreeing with Harry's words. Ron stared intently at Sherlock, as if he were about to transform into a groundnut and devour Sherlock whole if he wasn't given a proper reason. "Huh," Sherlock chuckled, his gaze shifting from Harry to Neville. "Neville, Harry has wronged you." "Wronged?" Neville pointed at himself in surprise. "Me, indeed. Facial expressions are how people express emotions, and your facial expressions are your faithful servant." "Sherlock, you mean you deduced Neville's thoughts from his facial expressions?" "Exactly, dear Harry. I drew my conclusion through facial expressions, especially his eyes." "But Neville, perhaps you can't even remember how you fell into deep thought." "Sorry, I can't remember." "Then let me tell you." Sherlock's speech suddenly quickened, his eyes sparkling as if you were in a state of excitement. "You were lying on the bed expressionlessly, but when Harry and Ron were talking about morning exercises, you suddenly turned over, facing us. It was this action that caught my attention. After that, your gaze fell on the foot of Harry's bed, where the wooden sticks Harry and I used for fencing practice in the mornings. So, I could tell from the changes in your facial expression that you were starting to think, though at that point I wasn't really thinking very far ahead. After a while, your gaze shifted to Harry's right hand. Then, you turned to look at me as I played the violin, and you looked hesitant. So, your meaning is obvious. You want to join Harry and me in our morning fencing team." Merlin's beard. "Sherlock, you've observed me so well," Neville exclaimed in surprise. Not only him, but Harry and Ron were also stunned. Was this even possible? "Actually, those weren't the only clues I used to deduce your thoughts. Remember that day Harry couldn't go with me to Quidditch practice? When I came back, I found you and Ron fencing, using these two sticks." Of course I remember, but what does that prove?" Ron asked, puzzled. "This shows Neville is very interested in fencing," Sherlock said confidently. "I even corrected your grip on your swords back then." Ron just nodded, but Neville's expression and actions told me he had taken my words to heart. "Even though I didn't see it, I'm certain of one thing," Ron quickly asked. "What is it?" "Neville must have been practicing fencing a lot in his dorm lately." "Right. Thanks to Reader 20221229120903657 for the 600 Kidian coins reward for Sherlock Holmes. And thanks to Tornado Jumping Monkey for the 100 Kidian coins reward. Your support is my motivation to update. Oh. Chapter 199. Don't come any closer. Sherlock, I'm truly impressed this time. Ron looked at Sherlock with admiration and said in a muffled voice, I have to admit, I did have some doubts about that claim that day, just a tiny bit, of course, my dear Ron, that's certainly very superficial. If you hadn't expressed some disbelief that day, I wouldn't have used this to distract you. Hearing Sherlock's words, Ron couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed, but more than that, he felt helpless. Was Sherlock really that competitive? Just to prove a casual remark, he'd held on to it all this time. But then he thought, this also meant that Sherlock acknowledged him, showing that he truly considered him a friend. If it were anyone else, Sherlock wouldn't care what they were thinking. That must be it. Ron was about to praise him when Sherlock suddenly produced a small glass bottle from his pocket, as if by magic. Now, you'd better drink this bottle of energy drink. I don't want to drink that stuff. Ron's face changed, and he shook his head repeatedly. I'd rather go with you guys for morning practice. Although he had just agreed to Sherlock's request, he was clearly planning to act like a scoundrel now. Anyway, I'm not drinking it. What can you do to me? You can't force me to drink it, can you? With all the sweet talk you give me, Sherlock, I'd rather starve to death, die outside, or jump off this cliff than drink a drop of your medicine. Seeing this, Sherlock didn't try to persuade him, but turned to the side. Neville, if you really want to learn fencing properly, then you and Harry will help Ron drink the energy drink, and after you do that, you drink it yourself too, Neville, you don't want to drag your cold body to morning practice with us in the cold morning, do you? Hearing Sherlock's words, Neville hesitated. Ron was stunned. He never expected Sherlock would actually go so far as to force-feed him the drug. Seeing the usually introverted and timid Neville becoming restless under Sherlock's encouragement, he immediately shouted, Hey, Sherlock, don't do anything rash. Then he turned to Neville. Neville, you'd better think this through. His words only solidified Neville's resolve. The next moment, Neville jumped off the bed and took the glass bottle containing the stimulant from Sherlock. Ron was stunned. Who said Neville was timid? He was incredibly brave. He instinctively tried to run away, but Harry held him tightly. Having trained with Sherlock for so long, Harry was no longer the frail man he once was. Ron, currently suffering from a cold, was also weak and could only let her do as she pleased. Seeing Neville approaching him step by step with the stimulant, Ron struggled desperately while shouting, Don't come any closer. However, before he could speak, Sherlock had already waved his wand. Whisper. With this whisper spell, Ron's loud shouts instantly became as faint as a mosquito's buzz, sounding almost like a pout. Don't come any closer, Neville laughed. For some reason, he felt a strange sense of relief and pleasure. Ron, it's time for your medicine, Neville spoke gently, but his actions were swift and decisive, pinching Ron's mouth shut and chugging the entire bottle down his throat. The agility and efficiency of his movements surprised even Harry, who was in charge of controlling Ron. He hadn't expected Neville to have this side to him. It was quite unexpected. Sherlock, on the other hand, smiled slightly. A satisfied expression on his face. How could one learn fencing without such spirit? The fact that the old man sorted Neville into Gryffindor proved that courage must be hidden deep within him. Look, his courage has appeared. Ron was forced to drink a stimulant by Harry and Neville. Steam immediately billowed from his bright red hair, and his head looked like it was on fire. Seeing this, Harry and Neville finally released Ron. Sherlock then handed Neville a second bottle of stimulant. Neville drank it down without hesitation, and his ears immediately started smoking. Ron was almost laughing in exasperation. Good grief, you're all meek and submissive to Sherlock, but you're all bark and bite when it comes to me, huh? He finally understood why Neville was sorted into Gryffindor. That round-faced guy was incredibly brave. The stimulant was very effective. By evening, Ron and Neville were much better. So, they discussed it and decided to target Dean. Simply put, they wanted to do to Dean what Harry and Neville had done to Ron. However, to their surprise, Dean, who usually looked so shrewd and calculating, proved surprisingly astute in this crucial moment. When Ron and Neville approached him with ill intent, he downed the potion in one gulp without a word. His ears started smoking. This infuriated Ron. He'd wanted to experience what it was like to force someone to drink medicine, but the kid hadn't given him a chance. What a disappointment. After that, Sherlock and Harry took some time to visit Hagrid. Their main purpose was to get some rock cakes from him, On the way, Harry repeatedly warned Sherlock not to mention that he wanted them to make a shield. Sherlock didn't seem to care, but agreed after Harry's earnest request. Hagrid, however, didn't think much of it and, upon hearing they wanted rock cakes, generously gave them a lot. After that, he mysteriously led them to the backyard. "Come with me, I have some good stuff here." "Good stuff? It's not those cabbage-eating slugs again, is it?" "What slugs? That's much more exciting, much more exciting." "Yeah, come on, come and see for yourself." Sherlock, listening to Harry and Hagrid's conversation, felt something was off. But when he followed Hagrid to the backyard, he immediately understood his intention. Pumpkins. Huge pumpkins. It's no exaggeration to say that 2 or 3 people could fit inside each one. How about that? Amazing, right? "This is what I prepared for Halloween." Harry stared wide-eyed in astonishment at the sight. Hagrid was right, this was just too exciting. He had never seen such huge pumpkins in his life. Each one was half a person's height. "Good heavens, Hagrid, how did you do that? What kind of fertilizer is so powerful?" "It's just the swelling charm, right?" No, how could I do that?" "You know, they broke my wand, I can't use magic anymore." Hagrid's face changed instantly upon hearing Sherlock's words, and he thought to himself, oh no, how could he have forgotten Sherlock's abilities? He should have only let Harry bring in. "Is that so?" Sherlock looked at the pink umbrella in Hagrid's hand. Seeing this, Hagrid quickly hid the umbrella behind his back. Harry also knew very well what secret Hagrid's umbrella held. Just as Sherlock said, everyone at Hogwarts had a secret. Noticing the troubled expression on Hagrid's face, he immediately said, "Sherlock, how about we talk about something else?" He then gave Sherlock a pleading look. "Sure," Sherlock nodded, pointing to the side. "These roosters seem to be doing quite well, of course." Hagrid immediately burst into laughter. "Sherlock, you know me, I'm a pro at raising animals. Speaking of which, the youngest Weasley girl came over a few days ago, and she said I did a great job." "Ginny." "Yeah, Harry, if you ask me, she definitely wouldn't refuse your autographed photo. If you say that again, I'm not playing with you anymore." Ha ha ha. The approaching Halloween meant the first Quidditch match of the season was about to begin, which meant Harry was attending morning practice less and less. Oliver Wood's enthusiasm for regular Quidditch training was high, and nothing could stop him. He was truly rain or shine. As a result, the person who went to morning practice with Sherlock every day became Neville. Since his cold was cured, he had joined Sherlock's morning practice group as agreed, learning fencing from him. As for Ron, it was still next time, for sure. After a morning practice session, Sherlock looked at Neville with satisfaction. "Neville, you really do have a talent for fencing." "Really?" Neville asked cautiously. "I don't lie unless necessary." Sherlock wasn't lying. He hadn't expected that such a small Gryffindor house could produce 2 fencing prodigies like Harry and Neville. Dumbledore had once said that there were 2 people who met the criteria for the savior of the wizarding world. Voldemort had ultimately chosen Harry. Did that mean Neville also possessed the potential to be a savior? Thinking of this, Sherlock couldn't help but have a bold idea. One Saturday before Halloween, a storm raged, with raindrops the size of soybeans pounding against the castle windows for days on end. The continuous rain had caused the lake to rise, turning the flower beds into mudflats. In this terrible weather, Harry, soaked and covered in mud, returned to Hogwarts Castle after training. He was in a terrible mood. It had nothing to do with the weather. Even without wind or rain, the training wouldn't have been pleasant. According to the Weasley twins' reconnaissance, their situation was dire. With a speed boost from the new Nimbus 2001, the Slytherins appeared as 7 blurry pale green shadows, whizzing through the air like jets. Upon hearing this news, Harry even felt a pang of regret. If he had been a little more forceful last time, Malfoy might have spent a longer time in the hospital. However, he quickly shook his head, dismissing the thought. Even if it weren't, with Madame Pomfrey's superb medical skills, even with his broken jaw, he would only need to spend 1 night in the hospital to recover. Annoying. "Harry." As Harry walked down the empty corridor, a pleasant voice suddenly called out to him. At the same time, a very beautiful girl with long, glossy black hair appeared before Harry, smiling at him. Chapter 208 Beautiful Encounter with Chiu Zhang. "Cho, what are you doing here? Shouldn't I be the one asking you that?" Hearing Harry's words, Cho Chang looked him up and down, somewhat puzzled, and asked, "What happened to you? Did something bad happen?" Harry felt a little embarrassed. Cho Chang was the seeker for the Ravenclaw Quidditch team, a friend Harry had only met last term. Actually, the two of them initially met thanks to Sherlock. Last Easter, the 7-colored eyeshadow her father had given her was stolen from Ravenclaw, so she came to Sherlock for help. For Sherlock, this kind of case was a piece of cake. It's just that the final result wasn't perfect. Although Sherlock found the stolen eyeshadow, Cho Chang lost a friend. But in Sherlock's opinion, such a friend was better off not being there. Ravenclaw's wisdom ultimately couldn't overcome the thorns growing wildly in her heart. After the incident was over, Cho Chang came with Ravenclaw prefect Penelope to thank Sherlock. That was Harry and Cho Chang's first meeting. Their first impressions of each other were quite good. At the end of last term, Harry and Sherlock were hospitalized for stopping Quirrell from getting the Philosopher's Stone. During their stay, prefects from all the houses visited their hero, and Cho Chang once again came with Penelope. It was then that Harry discovered Cho Chang was not only beautiful but also very easy to talk to. From then on, their relationship grew stronger. Harry kept in touch with Cho Chang throughout the summer, second only to Sherlock. By the start of this term, Cho Chang had become one of Harry's few close female friends. At this moment, Harry hoped Cho Chang would see him sitting with a group of cool people, laughing heartily at a joke he told. Not like this, soaked to the bone, his robes covered in mud, looking like a drowned rat. Seeing Harry's somewhat bewildered expression, Cho Chang burst out laughing. However, noticing Harry's embarrassed expression, she said gently, "It's all right, Harry, we can clean it up in no time." As she spoke, she drew her wand and lightly tapped Harry. Whirlwind, the rain and mud vanished instantly, and Harry's red Quidditch uniform looked brand new. After doing this, she tilted her head, thought for a moment, and waved her wand again, casting a warm-up charm on Harry. Harry immediately felt the icy sensation leave him, and his whole body felt warm. "Thank you so much, Cho," Harry said gratefully. "You've really helped me a lot." Startled by Harry's green eyes, Cho Chang blushed slightly. "You're too kind." "It was nothing." "Now, can you tell me what happened?" "It was indeed an unfortunate thing." Harry sighed deeply and briefly recounted what had just happened. "You mean, Malfoy's father bought every member of the Slytherin Quidditch team in Nimbus 2001 so Malfoy could join the house team?" Cho Chang's mouth gaped open in surprise. "How could he do that?" "That's so despicable." "It is indeed despicable, but it's too late to say that now." "They fly like jets," Harry said dejectedly. "I feel like we're going to lose again." "Don't be like that, Harry." Seeing Harry's expression, Cho Chang immediately comforted him. "My broom is a Comet 260. It's far inferior to the Nimbus 2000 or Nimbus 2001, let alone the 7 sweepers. But so what? I'm still playing Quidditch. I don't think a flying broom can separate you from Malfoy." Faced with Cho Chang's comforting words, Harry wasn't so easily convinced. He shook his head and explained to Cho Chang seriously, "If it were just Malfoy, that would be fine. I'm confident I could catch the golden snitch before him. But Slytherin has 7 broomsticks like Nimbus 2001. 7. I feel we're doomed, Harry. I think you're stuck in a rut." Seeing Harry's stubborn expression, Cho Chang patiently explained, "A great man from the East once said that what determines the outcome of a war is people, not things. The same applies to Quidditch. Broomsticks are important, but what truly determines victory or defeat is the player riding the broomstick, not the broomstick itself. Especially in a sport like Quidditch that heavily relies on the seeker." Harry looked at Cho Chang gratefully. "Cho, Cho Chang smiled gently. "More importantly, if we give up now, the game is over prematurely." Harry's breath hitched slightly. He felt healed by Cho Chang's smile. Cho Chang continued, "I believe in you, so please believe in yourself too, okay?" "Yes," Harry nodded emphatically. "Go back quickly later, you look like you need a good rest." Cho Chang seemed very happy that she had been able to pull Harry out of his slump. "By the way, I've been wanting to ask you, why do you always choose this kind of weather for training?" Cho Chang asked, somewhat puzzled. "Since it's windy and rainy outside, why can't you wait until the weather is better? Our captain would never change his training schedule for this kind of reason." Harry sighed deeply. Fred and George said that even if a forbidden spell were cast, it wouldn't stop Wood's enthusiasm for Quidditch. Cho Chang laughed again. "Sorry, I just couldn't help it. Actually, I've heard Prefect Penelope mention this Captain Wood a few times. But this is the first time I've heard such an interesting statement." "Ha ha ha." Cho Chang's laughter was even more captivating than usual, and Harry couldn't even look away. "Actually, I have an idea that will prevent you from doing this in your next practice. What is it? The impervious charm. It's an interesting spell that makes the target waterproof and fireproof. But it probably hasn't been taught in second year yet. Would you like to learn it? Cho Chang said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Harry immediately replied, please teach me. Sure, I'll teach you after Halloween. With that, Cho Chang waved to Harry and chuckled as she left. Harry watched her retreating figure, secretly clenching his fist. Even just for Cho Chang's encouragement today, he had to win. Only then would he feel comfortable learning from her after Halloween. Just as he was lost in his fantasy of learning spells from Cho Chang, a voice suddenly rang out behind him, startling Harry. He quickly turned around and saw that it was Nick Wilde, the Gryffindor ghost, almost headless. It wore a fashionable, feathered hat over its long, curly hair, and a knee-length, belted coat with a wheel-shaped ruffled collar that concealed the fact that its neck was almost completely severed. It was staring at him with a melancholy gaze. Harry, in a good mood after being comforted by Cho Chang, asked, Nick, you look troubled. Is something wrong? Harry swore he was just asking casually. In his mind, the other should have said nothing at that moment. To everyone's surprise, after he asked that question, the nearly headless Nick seemed to have found someone to confide in, and immediately began to talk non-stop to Harry. You know what? I was chopped in the neck 44 times with a blunt axe. 44 times. Potter, do you know how I survived that time? And even so, they still thought I wasn't qualified to join the Headless Hunters. Why? Oh, you might not know about the Headless Hunters. Come and see this. As he spoke, the nearly headless Nick took out a transparent letter from his tight-fitting coat. Harry was about to take it when it unfurled the letter and began reading aloud. Dear Sir Nicholas de Mincy Pippington, your report regarding your application to join the Headless Hunters has been received. Our team takes it very seriously and convened a special meeting immediately to study it. After democratic discussion by the captain, the vice-captains in charge, and all members of the Knights, we unanimously agree that the Headless Hunters can only accept hunters whose heads are separated from their bodies. Members who are not in this state will not be able to participate in Hunters team activities such as horseback juggling and head-balancing polo. Therefore, I regret to inform you that you do not meet our requirements. Thank you for your long-term support and care for the Headless Hunters. Best regards, Sir Patrick Podmore. Harry, Greek letterify, how to put it? It's so confusing. Next, the almost headless Nick, completely ignoring Harry's bewildered expression, continued to pour out his troubles to him. At this moment, Harry even felt that this ghost was possessed by Colin Creevey. In the end, even Harry himself didn't know how he had so casually agreed to attend its 500th anniversary celebration. Perhaps it was because of his conversation with Cho Chang that he was in such a good mood? Harry didn't think much of it. He'd go, it wasn't a big deal. With that thought, Harry headed towards the Gryffindor Tower. This time, he didn't encounter anyone else on the way. Back in his dormitory, Harry found only Sherlock. He was lying on his bed, his hands clasped together, chin resting on his hands, lost in thought. When Harry entered, Sherlock only glanced at him briefly before looking away. Harry was already used to Sherlock's state. He changed out of his red uniform and put back on his usual robes. After changing his clothes, Harry turned to Sherlock and said, Sherlock, you know what? I just ran into almost headless Nick in the hallway. He invited me to his 500th birthday celebration on Halloween Eve and told me to bring lots of friends. After recounting his conversation with almost headless Nick, Harry asked, so, do you want to go? Thanks to the Lewd God for the 100 Kidian coins. Your support is my motivation to update. Oh. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.